introducing everyone he could remember the name of, and offered to show them the farms and garden to extend the time. "No, thanks," said Marie. "I'd love a cup of tea and a shower, though." Dan said he couldn't help with the shower, and then turned red as his courage abandoned him entirely. Penny gladly took them away from him and explained how the water was heated in the bathrooms for washing. They were taken to their clothing store, or Primark as it had been dubbed. Lexi returned from the gym, where she had been teaching a chilly self-defense class, and heard of the new arrivals. She poked her head into medical and shrieked. "Paul!" she squealed, running to his bed and landing on him. A barrage of questions followed, none of which he could answer, as he was still barely conscious. Kate ejected her from the wing, and she excitedly grilled Dan for answers. "We rescued 3 from the local cast of Deliverance," he said. "I know nothing more about the bloke." "I do," she said, almost hyperactively. "He's an instructor at my club. He's amazing." Dan could not say he was put out to hear that she had interest in another man. "Just wait until he's better," she said. "He'll be able to teach everyone better than I can." And with that, she bounced from Oz. Dan and Steve exchanged looks of surprise. Lexi had a crush on the man, and luckily he was still alive. At dinner, the new arrivals, bar Paul, who was in medical with Lexi waiting on him, were greeted by Penny. They were told to relax for the night, and tomorrow they would be found a role to play. For Selena, that was purely academic. As someone with pharmaceutical knowledge, Kate had laid a very strong claim to her as a medical assistant. Marie was a different matter. Dan wanted her close, purely for selfish personal reasons, but she had no interest and no skill with firearms. She had other necessary requirements for the Rangers, but he had to find a way to keep her with his unit where he held sway. She had not made a big deal of her skills, saying in a self-effacing manner that she probably had very little to offer. Dan thought of expanding the ops role to justify having both Marie and Leah there. Because the group's numbers had grown so much that he could not keep up, Dan could not get close enough to Marie after dinner to capitalize her time without looking obvious. He gave up and went outside to smoke. To his surprise, Marie also came outside and lit a cigarette. She saw him and raised a conspiratorial eyebrow. "Dying breed," she said solemnly. "Very few of us antisocial smokers left in the world now." It seemed to be a well-rehearsed, break-the-ice smoking conversation. He didn't know what to say. All of his moody swagger deserted him when she spoke. "Have you thought of joining the ops department?" he asked in the absence of anything better to say. "Can't say, to be honest. Not sure I'd be much use to you gunslingers. I'm more used to pointing your type in the direction of baddies and saying fetch." Her smile took all the insult out of her words. He tried to reason with her, saying, "It's not about gunslinging. It's about tactical planning more than anything." She said nothing, so he pressed his advantage. "Fancy a drink?" he offered. "Long day," she replied flatly. "I'll probably just get to bed." Dan accepted this as chivalrously as he could, but reflected that he probably still seemed like a jilted boy as he walked inside, calling Ash after him. He stripped off his coat as he stood in his room, hoping for another glance of the captivating woman who was not in the slightest bit impressed with him. He gave up and went to bed. Revenge. Revenge is an act you want to commit when you are powerless and because you are powerless, said Billy magnanimously. Kyle thought that he couldn't give a single shit for the theory. He just wanted to hurt Dan. Badly. He'd run across country for as long as he could remember, terrified of that dog chasing him down and ripping his flesh like he had heard it did during the hospital fiasco. He had run for hours with no clear direction or purpose. As it got dark, he had no idea where he was, but he saw light from a fire, and he heard voices. He ran towards it, and as he burst through the trees and into their camp, he collapsed with exhaustion. The group seemed startled to see him emerge into their camp. They looked to Billy, who seemed to be calling every shot. Now he sat, wrapped warmly and given food and alcohol, and listened. "Relax, Kyle," said Billy with a smile. "You are amongst friends now." Kyle was petty and selfish, but he wasn't entirely stupid. He was a little worried about who these men were and what they did to people they found. "What's brought you to us, then?" said Billy. He was unsure whether to tell the truth at first, but his anger at how he felt he had been mistreated was very raw. Tears stung at his eyes as he realized what he had done, blaming anyone but himself. He told them about the house, about Dan and the Rangers, about how they strutted around with their machine guns while others had to work for their food. Billy lapped it all up, making the right noises and pulling sympathetic faces when Kyle's indignation reached its height. "I think we can help you, Kyle," he said, smiling a dangerous smile. Kyle would have his revenge on Dan and his smug bastards. Site 3. She had to admit that things were getting tiresome. There was only emergency generator power for the lighting and air recirculation, and this was run on a huge underground fuel tank. The systems were augmented by external solar panels, but these weren't enough to rely on alone, especially as they needed cleaning and were probably still covered in leaves. The generator was used to top up the batteries, and every day the power levels dropped slightly lower than the day before. One of the staff reckoned it would only last another month or so, and then they would be forced to go topside. Months ago, the order had come for their cabinet to lock down as an epidemic was feared. There was a query regarding biological warfare, which nobody had a definitive answer to. They had watched for 2 days how the country fell apart. Hospitals were inundated at first, then totally overwhelmed when people started to die. Looting started as soon as the bounds of social cohesion began to fray, which surprised nobody. Quickly, even the looters started to get sick and die. By the time the external power grid failed and severed their link to the cameras outside of their immediate control, there was nobody moving. 4 senior politicians had got through the screening process, which was basically that anybody who had the slightest raise in body temperature was deftly diverted to another room which did not lead to the bunker. With those politicians had come some key senior military commanders and their bag carriers, along with members of research staff who had been in place for some time, judging by their pale complexions. Add to this the maintenance staff and a handful of police officers assigned to escort and protect the politicians, and there were 36 souls locked underground. There had been 37, but one man was determined to open the sealed entrance and condemn them all in the hope that his family was still alive. One of the police officers had abruptly ended negotiations with the enraged man using a gun. Now it seemed, after months of living underground, there was no rescue coming, and no contact from the outside world either. Satellite phones, secure digital hardline networks, internet, radios, all had gone quiet weeks ago. People started to say that this was a global event, and speculation ran wild. 11 similar locations on the UK mainland had been activated simultaneously, and communications between 4 others had been established. 3 of those showed signs of outbreak within 12 hours of lockdown, and all contact was lost shortly after. The safe assumption was that they had all died. Contact only remained with one other bunker, Site 1, over 500 miles away in Scotland. It was in a very remote location intentionally, and was the secret base of virology where bioweapons were tested and constant theoretical war games were played. A modern-day plague was the new nuclear option, it seemed. Even better, actually, as it was deniable. The virology lab held synthesized accelerated samples of just about everything that could kill a person, and then tried to find ways of juicing its lethality to biblical proportions. Information security protocols were adhered to in the first few weeks, but as it started to dawn on everyone that this was very real, so the story began to unfold. From what the scientists had seen, this was a form of influenza based on their observations on camera. It had an unbelievably fast gestation period and was lethal within 48 hours. Exact cause of death was unknown, as no test subjects were available to be autopsied, but the best guess would be fever and heart failure. They swore it wasn't one of theirs, and voiced suspicions that if it was a bioweapon attack, then it would probably be airborne and most definitely Chinese. There were some in the bunker with various religious beliefs. Some of these hypothesized the coming of the end of days, which led to counter-arguments and eventually a number of heated fights, which had to be split up more than once. An aging lieutenant colonel with an impressive shock of white hair and a dazzling array of medals was all for their immediate departure. He planned to lead them on to a nearby barracks where they would be equipped as soldiers, and he would lead them onwards. Most people thought the man unstable, and it was rumored that the last time he had seen active service was before most of them were born. Their decision was made for them at the end of February, when the generator began to splutter and finally gave out. This year's resolution: don't die of suffocation in a hole in the ground. Back on the horse. February ended, and the weather improved slightly. A flurry of activity began on the farms and gardens. Seeds were planted, animals were moved around, and Chris spoke of his plans to introduce the young bull to their small herd of cows. All departments loaned extra bodies to help, and some renewed purpose infected the group. Dan decided to start pushing the fitness and skills of his rangers and had them in the gym 3 times a week, where he ran them until they sweated, then made them lift weights, and finished with a session on the mats, where they drilled over and over with close-quarters scenarios. Leah kept up as much as she could and paid close attention to the lessons and weapon retention. She had also been training with Lexi and was starting to develop some muscle. Twice Dan had overtly tried to get Marie to be part of Ops, and both times she flatly refused him. He raised good points with her skills of planning and organizing being an asset, but her mind was made up. He had even approached Penny about it, but she was firmly on Marie's side. Marie felt her professional experience was of no value yet. There weren't enough people to police, and nothing to investigate. She had decided to use her education in a more practical setting, and after some discussion, she became the group's first mental health professional. She had a degree in psychology, and through her work had been trained as a counselor. She had also studied art and offered to run a drawing class for anyone interested. She was allocated a room, furniture needs were met, and the rules of confidentiality firmly set. Similar to the medical records being established, Marie met each member of the group in turn, taking nearly 2 weeks, and discussed how they were coping. Nearly half of the group booked a return visit. Dan grudgingly attended, and he was as closed off about his past as he always was, but felt tempted to book a follow-up session just so he could spend more time with her. She fascinated him, but he couldn't get close to her without looking like a lost puppy. He tried to push her from his mind. He had a lot to plan for, with scouting trips and scavenging runs set to start again soon. Lexi had fussed over Paul, who was very groggy for the first week. Kate, using complex medical terminology, had declared him badly concussed with a raft of soft tissue injuries from the crash, and watched him like a hawk. "What's a subdural hematoma?" Leah whispered to Dan as Kate spoke. "It's a lump on the head," Dan answered in a stage whisper to annoy the paramedic, receiving a cold stare from Kate in reward. Paul insisted that he felt better and was released. The subject of his employment was raised in a council meeting, and Neil asked to talk to him with Mike to see if his architectural knowledge was of use to them. It turned out it was. Not only was he an architect, but he also site managed and had built a few commercial properties. He knew a little about scaffolding and was instantly hired. He also, being a bit of a gym nut and heralded as a ninja according to Lexi, agreed to take over the running of the fitness and self-defense programs. Interdepartmental requirements had been drawn up, and a long list of supplies was needed. Scaffolding and building tools were requested for engineering, equipment and feed for the farm, and food and water for stores, as their supplies had been depleted over winter. Sarah needed veterinary supplies and equipment for the horses. Kate needed medical supplies and an abundance of suturing kits, she joked. Dan raised a self-conscious hand to the neat zip marks on his face. Clothes were required, as was all the fuel they could find to keep their vehicles and generators running. All of these requirements had to be assessed, prioritized, and researched for the appropriate site. These sites then had to be checked by the rangers and declared a yes or no, and a decision made on if the teams should be escorted. Dan took a long list of notes and decided to call his whole team in the next morning for an admin day and to lay down new standard operating procedures. Neil, Mike, Carl, Ian, Adam, and Paul set to work planning how the solar panel project would work and wrote endless lists of requirements, including every vehicle battery from the larger vehicles that could be found. Jack was recruited to the engineering team for his haulage knowledge. Andrew worked with Jimmy to prioritize the required supplies and woke Liam from his bored hibernation. Everyone pretended not to know that he and Andrew disappeared during generator time to play on an old Xbox in a small room they had sequestered. Under Chris's leadership, the farms and gardens were starting to flourish. He knew what they needed and where it could be found. Dan decided to start the site recce's as soon as possible, discussing new operating procedures as his team worked. "Who is still happy to go out alone?" he asked them. They all were, despite the events of last year. He was thinking of doubling up on all trips, which met some resistance from the other three rangers. It was argued that it would put too much demand on them. Maintaining a permanent guard and potentially running 2 trips a day would be too exhausting. He had the final say, and was tempted to demand slower progress to make sure they always had backup. He felt that he was being overprotective, and when the realization that he was giving advice he wouldn't take hit him, he relented. "If a site looks dodgy, though, we send at least 2 to run protection," he declared, as Molly jumped onto the table and walked over their maps and notes with utter disdain. "Leah, do you need to do some target practice?" he asked in a light tone. She smiled widely and nodded. "Good. Shoot that bloody flea bag, please," he said, making the others laugh. Leah was annoyed at him for using her as a joke prop again and picked up the evil cat lovingly. It sat on her lap, kneading her legs with its paws, and shot Dan a stare of pure loathing and superiority. He would set Ash on that thing happily, only he couldn't be sure of the outcome. If only the cat could be trained, they could pack the guns away permanently. A prioritized list of sites and supplies was produced, and Dan deployed all 4 of them one morning with Neil taking over the guard. Steve was sent to a large supermarket with Jimmy riding as observer, Lexi to the B&Q they had checked once before with Mike, Joe to an agricultural wholesaler with Chris, and Dan went to a smaller outpatient hospital, taking only Ash, as he knew what he was looking for. They all had 2 or 3 other secondary sites, which would be on the return trip, all mapped out by Leah with Steve's help. If any of them didn't return, then the others would retrace their steps in the morning. The rest didn't need explaining. They had all been coached in escape and evasion by Steve, and all of them knew what to do. At least Dan hoped they would. Leah asked to go with him, but he asked her to stay and compile the reports, promising her a trip soon. Even the evident disappointment on her face could not dissuade him. Dan reached his target by mid-morning, carefully circling the building on foot with Ash at his side. No sign of anyone, but the hospital had clearly been looted some time ago. The smell of the dead was different now. Not the gut-churning stench of rotting bodies, but instead the musty smell from the drying corpses which had frozen and thawed repeatedly over the winter to be twisted into grotesque poses. He thought it was best not to look at them much. The looting appeared to have been done in haste and destructively. Dan was appalled at the unprofessionalism he saw, until discovering that the only medication that seemed to have been taken was from a locked metal cabinet which had contained a dark green liquid. Methadone. Typical that out of the world's remaining population, at least one heroin addict would have survived. The other medicines and equipment seemed mostly intact, so he made a more thorough check of the building before returning to his discovery. He smoked as he wrote notes on the site: access point, hazards, location of supplies, etc. He started on his long return route with, he guessed, 5 hours of daylight left. Twice more he stopped as he found the addresses of another ambulance outstation and a veterinary practice which specialized in large animal care. Both buildings were intact, and there was no sign of danger in the areas. Dan's last stop took him past home to a motorway service station to the south. There he found a multitude of lorries, all waiting under the watchful eyes of dead drivers for their CB radios and large batteries to be plucked from them. On his notes, he recommended checking what the cargo was before stripping them, in case they found 20 tons of something really useful already gift-wrapped. He returned late afternoon and sat with Leah, who had poured him coffee. He gave his reports as instructed by the domineering, almost teenager, who he noted had donned her vest with its empty holster in honor of being the senior member of Ops on site all day. He recommended an escorted trip with Kate and Sierra riding with him. One crew from logistics with a small lorry should do it. He congratulated Leah on the route and suggested the recovery operation went the same way. Hospital first, then pick up another ambulance for Kate to drive and empty their supplies, then to the vet for Sierra to pick up what she wanted. The lorry park was a good bet, but he wanted a separate trip for that with Jack and Ian along, as well as 2 rangers and all the logistics crews. Steve returned with a boot full of choice items and Jimmy ready to lead the way. There were no issues with the supermarket. Lexi returned with Mike, who was happy that the tools they would need were readily available and had found a well-stocked scaffolding yard on their way back, but couldn't get the loaded lorry started to bring it back. Joe walked back in, limping and carrying a box. Chris followed as Joe deposited the box on the table. It contained 3 very small bundles of black fur. The story was not a happy one. They found the wholesalers with ease, and the stores there were worth going back for. As they searched, though, Joe was attacked by a desperately wild collie. She was filthy and bone-thin, and after she had bitten clean through Joe's trousers and taken a chunk from his calf, he shot her. Only afterwards did Joe and Chris hear the tiny sounds the surviving puppies made after their mother had attacked the intruders to protect them. Joe felt terrible and was close to tears. Chris was far more pragmatic about it and judged that neither she nor the puppies would probably have lived through to spring. He shared that he had had to shoot one of his own dogs once, as it turned savage without warning and started killing sheep. Sierra agreed with Chris's prognosis, declaring the puppies very malnourished and saying that she would be surprised if any of them lived a week. Joe was marched into medical, where Kate set about him. Dan looked out of the window, guessing there was probably an hour of light left. He told Leah to grab Lexi's sidearm and her own emergency bag. She flew from the chair and was ready in seconds. He pushed the Land Rover down now familiar roads, eager to be back by dark, especially as he hadn't thought to bring the night vision goggles. They reached the small shop they had visited before, as Dan remembered seeing what they needed there. He let Leah do a quick sweep of the building, never miss an opportunity for training, before he grabbed baby bottles and tubs of milk powder. He ended up throwing almost all of it into a bag before driving back. It wasn't ideal, Sierra thought, but it would at least give them a chance of survival. Spring is in the air. Leah interviewed the 3 new joiners. They knew of lots of interesting things in the city, but the general consensus from all 3 was that the city was a bad place to visit. Marie described the place as being plagued by pirates. What wasn't spoiled or looted was prey to roving gangs of people who wouldn't exactly be welcome in their new society. These reports were put to Dan, who decided categorically to avoid the larger population centers and stick to the more rural areas, which had served them well so far. He explained this to the council and found no disagreement. The run to the lorry park was made first. Dan wanted to lead, as always, but Steve stepped in to softly persuade him that he would go with Lexi. They were gone from dawn till dusk and returned full of excitement. They had found countless trailers full of useful supplies and recovered an entire truck full of batteries. They had finally got 2 articulated lorries started and brought back hundreds of bottles of water in one and another full of tinned food. That put the trip to the supermarket on the back burner. They had encountered no problems, and Dan grudgingly left Steve in charge of the next 4 days of recovery runs there. They had to dump the empty trailers nearby, as there simply wasn't room for them at the house. Andrew was busy with all the available bodies, unloading and sorting the new loot as quickly as possible so that they could get going by the following dawn. After 4 days, they were exhausted, and Dan declared them officially stood down until Monday. They couldn't afford to crash through tiredness. The next day, Dan took Adam and Jay with Thera and Kate to clear the hospital and vet's surgery. The weekend passed without incident, and lorry park operations resumed on Monday. Jack argued to bring back a porta cabin for additional storage space, which was supported. Neil also went with them to siphon another tanker of diesel from the large tanks of the lorries. They set the porta cabin up at the side of the loading bay to their stores, and Carl began to stack and wire the lorry batteries together. It was one of those moments where having someone not qualified watching slows a professional down significantly, but it was insisted upon that he show Mike what he was doing and why. Surge protectors and other such complicated matters were discussed, all of which sailed over Dan's head. Plugs, fuses, and bulbs were the extent of his electrical knowledge. By the time he returned with a lorry full of medical and veterinary supplies, another stocked ambulance, this one being a special weather one, miraculously a Land Rover Defender, and another 4x4 from the veterinary practice, the battery bank was wired and weatherproof. Leah rode shotgun for him, taking her role ever so seriously. They drove in alert silence with Ash nosing his now huge head between the seats, so it seemed that all three played I Spy. The scaffolding trip wasn't a priority, as the weather wasn't yet good enough for the project, and the abundance of supplies from the lorry park was taking most personnel off-site for days. Dan accepted the back seat on that detail and rotated the other 3 rangers to go in pairs as the full logistics and engineering teams went out for another week. By mid-March, they had accrued more supplies than they could actually store, and Andrew began to backfill empty barns on the gardens and farm with the sturdier food supplies. Every day the teams went out to return with new fully laden trailers which were hastily unloaded by a kind of all-hands approach. The next morning they would eat a large breakfast and set off again, with the group's former professional drivers putting in more hours behind the wheel than they used to. March ended, and so did the runs to the lorry park, as they had scavenged all that they could. Pallets were added to the battery bank, and another layer of lorry batteries added and wired in. Dan was sure it wouldn't pass a health and safety inspection, but as long as any fire there didn't threaten the house, then he was okay with it. Carl assured him that it was far enough away, but still added a load of foam and CO2 extinguishers to the shopping list. Dan checked the ops calendar in early April, seeing a curious marking on the following Thursday. It had hearts and stars on it, and the number 13. It was Leah's 13th birthday. Bad Parenting 101. What to get a newly minted bona fide teenager on her first post-apocalyptic birthday? Dan had an idea, and frankly couldn't give a toss if nobody agreed. She had earned her keep in ops. She'd put in the boring work, studied the maps, and learned everything from scratch. She could clean and dismantle weapons better than all but 3 of the group, and had proven herself enough to be given lessons on handling the Glock. Now, if she were to take her first adult step into Dan's new trade, she would need to send something a little heavier towards the enemies of the group. All 4 M4s were in use, which left the HK-416s and the G-36Cs. The 416 was essentially the same weapon as the M4, and in his opinion too long for her to handle easily. The G-36C was shorter and only weighed a shade under 4 kilos. He stripped one down and checked it. It was spotless, as Leah had cleaned it under his instruction. He had never really liked the weapon, but hoped it would fit her nicely. He secretly had Lou prepare a scavenged harness from the surplus shop to hold a Glock, 2 spare mags, and another pouch to take 2 mags for the G36. He decided that it was sensible to let Steve take her for the next element of training, as he liked the sassy little girl too much to be objective if she wasn't ready yet. Still, he wanted to be the one to give her the present. To make it less of a military-style present, he also scavenged a laptop, an iPod, and lots of chart CDs he hoped she liked, and spent 3 entire evenings' worth of electricity time copying them onto the iPod. He only told Penny, Lexi, and Kara, and between them they planned a surprise party. He told the party committee what he planned to give her, having prepared his arguments in advance. There was some resistance to begin with, but it was Leah's wish to be trained in this field. Others reasoned that she should still learn other skills, which Dan didn't object to at all. Whispers had gone round, and plans made. Every department head decided to get her something, and one afternoon, Dan and Lexi led some others on a small shopping trip to get the items on the lists. Looting for survival was an unremarkable activity nowadays, but looting for presents and wrapping paper felt strange, like the excitement of Christmas again. A sticky suggestion came from Kate, who raised a parallel with Leah's chosen career path and the child soldiers of African civil wars. It was done carefully to avoid insult, but made Dan pause. If an 8-year-old kid could use an AK-47, then he was sure Leah could manage the G36. Having realized that he had completely missed the point of the comment, he drifted back from his thoughts in time for the suggestion that she be given mandatory weekly counseling sessions to mentally prepare her. He thought this a great idea. Agreed. I'll speak to Marie about it, he said too quickly. A smirk showed on a few faces, and his further attempt to explain just left him in a deeper hole. He gave up and outlined his plan. Leah's training will be thorough, but I have no intention of deploying her alone as a resource yet, he said as professionally as he could to recover some poise. She must be a skilled all-rounder before that happens in the future, which includes driving and survival skills. They all agreed. Penny visibly relaxed when she realized that Leah wasn't to be handed a gun and sent out into the remains of the world. I'm trying to future-proof our survival here, he said tiredly. Who is to say how long I'll be fit to do my role? Leah will effectively be coached to replace me when she's old enough, or I'm too old. That surprised a couple of them, as they clearly hadn't thought past this generation. On that note, started Chris, we could do with more people and some youngsters to start training in a similar way. I know Pete needs an apprentice. Murmurs of agreement went round the table, and the plans for the new apprenticeships were born. Dan's attempts to spend time with Marie were unsuccessful, to describe it mildly. She was always ahead of him, and whenever he made a clumsy suggestion, she cut him off. He decided to be brief and businesslike instead of playing the supplicant fidgeting with his hat. He found her room and knocked. "Come in," she said from inside. He did, and found her with a large towel wrapped around her and wet hair. They both had a moment of awkwardness, which she turned into his discomfort entirely by asking him what he wanted as she sat on her bed and smiled at him. He explained briefly, stuttering his way through before he left. Crashed and burned again. Happy birthday. I got you a gun. The morning of Leah's birthday came, and she still hadn't said anything. The day started as normal, with the morning activity causing the flow of people to congregate in the dining hall. Leah shuffled in, groggy as always, and stopped in suspicious surprise as everyone was looking at her. "Happy birthday," Penny said in her sing-song assembly voice. Everyone chorused in with the same, and Leah turned crimson, looking like she might cry. Ops presented her with the laptop, and Neil gave the iPod and speaker dock from engineering, which made her squeal with delight. Kara uncovered an array of her favorite foods, while Penny gave her a leather-bound diary. Chris, on behalf of the farms, gave her a set of boots like Dan's, which would have cost over £200 last year. Medical, via Kate, gave her a compact field medical kit and promised her the training to use it. Next, Lou got a nod from Dan and she laid a heavy package in front of Leah. She tore at the wrapping as politely as she could, then froze. It was a tactical vest, lifted in silence as she slept and painstakingly transformed under torchlight by Lou. She ran her hands over it and rested them on the pouches for the larger magazines. She looked at her mentor, who nodded and told her that her training was kicking up a gear. What a terrible world, he thought, that a teenage girl was so excited to be given such things. Still, he was happy that she was happy and oddly proud of her. She didn't know what to do first. She ate mostly pastries for breakfast, then dressed in black combats and her new boots before bouncing back downstairs, pulling on her winter coat, which was similar to Dan's. The weather was definitely improving with longer daylight hours, and nobody was still wearing the base layers which had been so popular over the worst of the weather. There were still some frosts, but spring felt imminent. "You do know you've got the day off, don't you?" Dan asked as she walked into ops. She looked instantly deflated. "Do I get to choose what to do today?" "Okay, I'll rephrase that. You can do what you like today," he replied. "I'd like to learn to shoot then," she said. Dan nodded agreement and unlocked the armory, selecting the G36s and 4 magazines. They loaded them, as Dan began again from the beginning about the rules for holding a firearm, this time including her mandatory counseling sessions and that her regime would be dictated by Steve. "Aren't you teaching me?" she asked. He thought about how to respond and tell her that he was too fond of her to be objective, in the end settling on, "Steve will be better at it, and I have lots of things to do. I will be assessing you anyway." She seemed happy enough with that, and they went for some target practice. Over the wall. The colonel was somewhat overenthusiastic, and she wasn't the only one worrying that he had possibly suffered an episode, or maybe she had witnessed the rapid onset of degenerative brain disease. The man was issuing orders and laughing aloud, but being mostly tolerated by the group, who were busy packing the remaining supplies for their uncertain future outside. She had long since abandoned her tailored skirt suit and heels, and had resorted to the comfortable jumpsuits designed for those living underground for extended periods. Now she was in boots and overalls not unlike a pilot's flight suit, loading a bag and ready to walk out with the others. It had been years since she had really walked anywhere or carried her own bags, let alone both. There was a general feel of a plan, but no real plan, and certainly no actual leadership. All those senior and important people in one place was bound to cause friction, as most had their ideas, which they would then try to bully others into supporting. The world of politics could well end with these few people wasting what remained of their lives arguing, she thought. She would wait until they had established somewhere, then name herself Prime Minister as the most senior cabinet member left. Everyone carried their own food and water. Those who were armed when they came in felt more secure, and she started to notice a shift in the established power balance. For years, these politicians had been protected by armed police officers, and most saw them as part of the furniture-type people. Now the politicians stuck to them and started to see them as valuable people. There was no secret weapons cache in the bunker, much to the annoyance of the colonel, who was loudly voicing his hopes that this was a Russian act of war and he would finally get to stick it to Ivan. It was pretty much ignored by everyone at the end, including his own kind, some of whom had abandoned the dress uniforms most of them wore in favor of utilitarian clothing. The time came when they could wait no longer, and without ceremony, Site 3 opened its sealed steel doors which had protected them for months. The pressured door hissed as it was unlocked, letting cool air in from outside. As this happened, one girl from the research team quietly said to herself with a resigned sigh, "We all just died." Thinking ahead. Penny called the group to hush during breakfast, engaging with the regular niceties which Dan wouldn't have bothered with. She looked pale and thinner, he thought. Maybe some time outside would be good for her. Spring was fast approaching, and she explained the needs and expectations of them all. The priority now was to plant and rear as much as possible during the good weather. "We will also work on winter-proofing our home for better comfort," she declared. "I'm sure everyone knows we are looking to establish some solar power and possibly hot water when we are equipped to do so. Now, your departmental heads have work for you. Have a good day, everyone." Chris was by far the busiest. He had limited support. Those assigned to the gardens were equally as busy, but Chris was never really given a break during the busiest time for his trade. He had given his simplified plan to the council recently: expand their livestock through breeding, get enough feed for them, grow vegetables. Andrew was in support, and having had a winter to see how the food stores fared, he believed that the farms had 3 to 5 years to take over supplying the group before the stocks ran out. Dependent on numbers, obviously, he added. That got Dan thinking. They still needed more of them to make this work. Logistics was stacked with premises to empty, and both crews went on a planned route daily with multiple places to hit. Engineering had recovered the scaffolding lorries and made a further trip to the distribution place where they had got the lorry full of parts. This time they returned with thin metal cylinder tanks as well as more panels. More trees were felled near to the house and dragged to the driveway by tractor to be cut up. The space left was requested by Chris to put pigs in when they were expecting. They could have a steady food supply of kitchen waste then. Steve offered to help and build the fenced pen bit by bit. He said it gave him back a small bit of normality. A semicircular arc was added to the pen for shelter, and the first occupants were herded down the driveway. Chris wanted his new 4-legged assistant to help, but she was still very weak, and Sarah said no. Out of the 3 puppies, 2 had died. They were badly malnourished, and frankly, the vet marveled that they had lived as long as they had. The survivor was a bitch with jet black fur and a white chin, chest, and belly. Anna named her Pig, from a book she had read about a farmer with a sheepdog. Pig had just about made it through with the milk substitute, and once she could manage solids, she grew much healthier by the day. She was kept inside by Sarah until she was happy that the puppy would live. As it was, Pig was going to be a small dog, but there was no way to say for sure if she would be okay in the long term. Ash was very curious about the little collie sniffing around his paws. He could have fit the entire dog in his mouth easily, yet it scared him, and he would jump out of its way. As he became used to this and Pig grew stronger on her feet, it became an intentional game between them. Andrew and Liam had started to go out to scavenge again locally, ensuring that every spare storage space was stocked full. The main aim of the Rangers was to find survivors and recruit, but Steve was set as house guard and trainer for a month. His suggestion was a period of intense firearms training for Leah, then a more relaxed pace from there on after. Penny had organized further clearances of the house, opening up another floor of living space as people were asking for their own rooms. The office spaces were emptied and beds brought in. All the unwanted and unusable detritus from the newly reclaimed space went for burning. In all, the house was a hive of activity, with nobody asking for a day off. Not that they would have got one. Greener grass. Kyle lay on the filthy ground where he had been for weeks. His long, wispy beard was matted with something. He didn't know what it was, but a good guess was that it was his own shit. It must be old because they hadn't fed him for days. He drank when it rained through the holes in the roof to fill his pan up, and every day he wished he had kept his head and not tried to remove Dan's. He still hated him, even more now that he knew he would die here because of him. It was his fault, him and his elite followers. A voice inside Kyle told him that not even Dan would treat him like this. "Shut up!" he shouted back, then slapped a hand over his mouth and froze. If he shouted, he would be beaten again. "Don't upset them," he thought to himself. "If you are good and quiet, they might feed you." They had fed him well before, when he told them about the group and Dan and his guns. They stopped him then. "Where are these guns?" the leader, Billy, asked, leaning close to his face. Something in the way he said it made him worry about everyone there and what this man would do to them. He realized that this man was a bully too. He was like Dan, but this one never pretended to be good. He tried to politely refuse them, so they beat him. Then they beat him again, and again, and again. Then they locked him away, remembering to beat him every so often to bring out any of the minute details he had forgotten to tell them. He had been in this box for longer than he could remember now, and it was all Dan's fault. Nikita. "Begin," said Steve, activating a stopwatch. Leah drew the Glock and opened the door. She moved in a crouch, which Dan knew was a strain on the legs. She had clearly been working on her strength and fitness. She moved methodically through the building, which Steve had set up, but Leah had never seen before, clearing each room perfectly and quietly. She took the stairs backwards, gun and eyes pointing the same way. She eventually came to the blind spot where he waited for her. He heard her pause outside the room. He could feel her breathing. A noise to his left made him turn, and as he turned back, he saw Leah had entered the room fast and stood with the gun held level with his chest. She was a little too close, but he was not confident that he could disarm her without getting shot. He walked outside with her pacing backwards, never losing sight of her target. Joe walked in behind her, shouting, and she turned and pulled the trigger twice, one in the chest, one in the head. Too late, she turned back to Dan. He was on her, knocking the weapon from her hands. She let her left hand drop away from the gun, and she saw this happening and simultaneously drew the knife from her left shoulder strap. Her right hand gripped his vest as the knife was rested against his neck. "Stop!" roared Steve. She let him go and sheathed the blade before picking up the empty gun and sliding in the magazine from her vest. She smiled at Dan. Then holstering the gun, she turned to Steve for her assessment. "How did you know he was there, and how did you distract him?" he asked her. She slipped a hand into a pouch as she said, "It was the last room, and the only place big enough to hide him. Plus, he breathes like an elephant." Then she withdrew her hand from the pouch and produced a small handful of Haribo. "Cost me a cola bottle, though." Dan laughed, realizing the noise was a soft sweet hitting the carpet after she threw it over the door he hid behind. The kid was clever, and fast. "I'm changing your name to Nikita," he said with a smile. "Why?" she shot back. Dan sighed, and Steve promised to find the book. "Did they make a film of it?" she asked hopefully. Steve sent her back to the house and filled Dan in as they strolled along. "A mile and a half is just over the 9-minute mark," he said, impressed. Dan commented that she was in paratrooper time. "She can do pull-ups, too. Only a couple at a time, but she's getting fitter. Paul has been working on the hand-to-hand stuff and says that she's getting better by the day," he continued. "She's competent at putting rounds downrange, but I'm going to develop that next." Dan was pleased and thanked Steve for his good work. He was tired as he'd been taking over on Steve's duty days to give him time to train her. "I might look for a short wheelbase defender for her, and I'll take over for the driver training if you don't mind." Steve didn't. He saw how much Dan cared for the girl and asked him if he had any kids. Dan was silent for a while as he lit a cigarette. "Girl and a boy. They would have been 6 and 4 by now," he said sadly. "2 boys," Steve shared in return. One was with his mom. The other was away at university. Dan asked if there was hope there, but Steve told him the last contact he had was to say that he was too ill to come home. Both full of sadness and regret, they walked on in silence. Major feat of engineering. Logistics were reassigned to help the engineering team. The scaffolding went up slowly, and one by one the solar panels were fixed onto a frame of Mike's design. A further trip had to be made for more poles and fixings, and progress was slow. Mike shared his vision with Dan as he smoked one morning, with Ash playing with Pig and the spaniels around their feet, as Pete used a pressurized air rifle to remove a nest of pigeons from the trees marked for felling. "The A-frame rests over the roof so that we don't have to compromise the integrity of the tiles," Mike explained. "We'll hopefully get 10 water tanks on the apex to be heated by the top rows, and the rest will power the battery bank. Even better, Adam and Carl are confident that they can fit a power shower in each bathroom." That was welcome news. Mike went on to explain that he intended to reroute the guttering for a form of toilet flushing and water supply. As he began to explain in more detail, Dan became lost and politely cut him off by saying what a great job he was doing. "When do you reckon you'll be finished?" Dan asked. Mike sucked a breath in, performing a practiced routine of haggling. Dan was tempted to ask for the straight answer, but found himself playing along. 6-month project minimum," Mike started. "And that's not taking into account any bad weather or technical problems." "Cut the bullshit. What's this going to cost me?" Dan said in jest, making Mike laugh. "Just let me know if you need anything," Dan finished before he walked away, calling Ash to stop playing and follow. He was happy with the engineering side, but he was worried about Chris. He looked very tired and had been working long hours with Anna on the farm. Pete had taken days at a time off hunting to help him. He decided that the ranger's new priority was another recruitment drive. He walked into Ops to see Lexi and Joe kitting up for their tasks. "New objective, people," he declared confidently as he strode in. "Find more survivors. We need more hands here, and we've been focusing too internally." They looked at each other, then back to Dan to accept their new task. "Take an extra jerry can of diesel and try to stay out as long as you can. Be careful," he said, then opened a map to give them directions so as not to overlap. He kitted up himself and called Ash to him. He put Ash's Christmas E&E dog vest on him with a spare water bottle and packet of food, and went to tell Steve where they were going. Happiness is purpose. He didn't really know how to explain it, not without upsetting people. But Joe was happier now than he had ever been. Not at first, not when he was sleeping on the floor of his shop and waiting for someone to tell him what to do. But now, right now, this very moment, was the best moment of his life so far. He had been a failure before. He tried hard, but just wasn't good enough, so they said. Now he was driving a hardcore truck and carrying an assault rifle and a handgun. Not only did he have all this great stuff, but he knew how to use it. Joe was under no illusion that he was great. Dan and Steve were both ex-military. That was obvious. Lexi was fit and could fight, plus she'd already proven herself. He never mentioned this, in case the thought of stenciling a bad guy on the wing of your Land Rover was distasteful. Shit. Even the vet had seen more action than him. He wasn't immature about it, and certainly wasn't out to look for trouble, but he wanted to prove himself. He was fitter, stronger, and more capable to handle himself than ever before. He practiced with his weapons until he was confident in himself. The only remaining test was a real-life scenario. If he followed the instructions from Dan and Steve, he would avoid problems. That wouldn't prove his worth much, but he was determined not to screw up. He drove west, and after an hour started stopping at the places most likely to have attracted survivors. He found evidence of people having looted, indicating survivors had been there, but no evidence of people still there. Another hour, and still no sign of life. By lunchtime, he had crossed into Wales and struck gold. In truth, they had found him, not the other way around. He drove along the lane into a village and was so surprised to see another vehicle coming towards him that he didn't react straight away. The other car, a normal family estate, stopped in the road. Joe stopped, and the two had a standoff for a few seconds. Joe forced himself to think, what was he supposed to do now? He had expected to find grateful people huddled in terrible conditions waiting for rescue. The driver of the estate acted first by reversing away. Joe snapped out of his daze and dropped his own vehicle into gear to follow. He flashed his lights desperately, trying to get them to stop. They didn't, and after a poorly executed J-turn, they were pursued by Joe to a campsite. The occupants of the car, 2 young women he saw, fled behind the buildings, shouting. A booming sound echoed out as a woman appeared from the side of a caravan, lowering a shotgun to point it at Joe. He was sure this was a defensive thing and that they were not attacking him. He switched off his engine and slowly climbed out of his cab, keeping both hands up. He had the Glock on his right leg and had intentionally left the rifle out of sight. The woman with the shotgun came towards him, scared and desperate. He started to talk, but she screamed at him to shut up. "You tell him we are not his property," she said, confusing Joe. "Who?" he asked. "You know full well who I'm talking about. That bastard wants girls. No amount of threats will make us get on our backs for him. Now fuck off and tell him that," she said, snarling at him. "Look," he said reasonably, "I'm nothing to do with anyone here. I've come from miles away looking for more survivors." She glared at him, considering the possibility that she had been wrong. "Seriously," Joe said, "I've never been here before, and you are the first people I've spoken to since I left home today." She thought about this and asked, "How many of you? Where?" "Feel free to put that down and I'll tell you everything," he countered reasonably. "No," she snapped. "You're still armed?" "Fine," said Joe, turning his right leg towards her. "Take it. But I'm not your enemy." She studied him for a bit longer, then abruptly lowered the shotgun. "Talk then," she said impatiently. Joe told her his story from the start, quickly catching up to today. As he spoke, the 2 women from the car appeared and listened intently. The woman gave a gruff account of how they had found each other in the days since, and had lived off the village in this campsite until winter forced them to look further away. That led them into a neighboring town where they first met King Pat. He had a dozen followers, shabby little boys really, but they did whatever he told them to do. "We call him Fagin. You know, like in Oliver Twist," she said. Joe knew. "He told us we had trespassed in his kingdom and that we had to serve him or pay the price." The price turned out to be that they work for him. She refused, and they had been hunted for nearly 2 weeks. "We can help," Joe said. "Come with me." Fagin. Joe made 2 mistakes. First, he didn't notice the vehicle that had followed him. Second, he didn't tune into the sound of another 3 vehicles approaching as they talked. By the time he noticed, it was too late. They were in the campsite. The woman screamed that Joe had led them to her. He ignored her and took action to make up for his failure in observations. He drew the Glock and emptied the magazine into the radiator of the lead vehicle, sure that he was right to resist this self-proclaimed king. The car stopped, blocking the gateway, as water poured from the underside of the engine. That wouldn't be moving anywhere soon. The woman fired her remaining loaded cartridge into the windscreen, peppering it with spider webs as the shatterproof glass held. Joe yelled at her for another way out. "Field," she yelled, pointing behind the buildings. "Yours will make it, but ours won't." "Get the girls in, now," he said to her as he retrieved his rifle from the cab. As he rounded the defender and leveled the gun, a voice rang out from behind the crippled roadblock. "You, in there, with the gun," it bawled, full of scorn and cruelty. "Those women are my property. Everything here is my property, and you are trespassing on my sovereignty." He turned to see the three women dragging another with handfuls of possessions. The one with the gun bundled the others inside and turned to Joe. "That's the bastard," she said angrily. "Tell me about the way out," he said. "Field. Leads back to the road. About a mile, but rough ground." Joe's thoughts were pulled back to the blocked entrance, where King Fagin began shouting orders which would leave them flanked. He fired 10 carefully placed rounds at the other cars. Some ricocheted off wheel rims, but most connected. He put 2 into the only other exposed grill, which was the one furthest away. Satisfied that they would not be chased, not by these cars anyway, he jumped in and started the Land Rover. The women were all shouting at once, and he was fairly certain that none of them trusted him. He drove carefully over the uneven ground, but still bounced his passengers around to their annoyance. He turned to the woman in the passenger seat and asked if her shotgun was reloaded. "No, I've just used the last 2 cartridges we had." He paused when they reached the road and reloaded both of his weapons. He pushed the gate open with the vehicle, breaking the fixings easily, and sped down the road to put distance between them and the last place they were seen. He shouted over the noise of the unhappy passengers and asked for directions towards England. King Patrick was fuming. How dare a trespasser step foot on his land and take his possessions? How dare he fire a gun at his boys? He looked at the wreckage of 3 cars that would never drive again, angry. He vowed to find this thief and hang him for his crimes. He sent his cleverest boys to follow them on a motorbike. He would find him. Joe drove hard for 20 minutes before stopping and pulling the Defender off the road. He took his rifle and told the women to wait there. He had to be sure he wasn't followed. He set himself up with a good view of the road, and after a few minutes he heard an engine. As it came into sight, he saw a teenage boy coming slowly, clearly looking to follow them. He couldn't let that happen. He hoped he was right, and pulled the trigger. Unhappy campers. Lexi drove for hours, checking to a junction towards the noises he heard.
A prison. That's where they've set up shop.
He waited longer to be thorough. Another Land Rover came in shortly afterwards with a girl driving and 2 others in the vehicle. This place was well equipped, he reckoned. He started his bike and retraced his steps, having to stop to fill up his tank using the hosepipe he carried just before crossing into his home country. He rode fast, trying to use the last of the daylight to get back, finding the wreckage of his friend's dropped bike still where he left it. His body was gone. The noise of his bike made people look up at his arrival. He ignored the questions about where he had been and what he knew. He took his news straight to the king.
Your Highness,
he called loudly, dropping to one knee as the 2 most trusted of them eyed him with scorn. They puffed themselves up, forcing their dominance over him. They knew their friend was dead, and this one now returned with news. The king rewarded good news, and they had none to offer where he obviously did. He would be climbing the food chain tonight, and they didn't like it.
Come up, boy,
said His Highness King Patrick from his seat on the raised platform. He did. He told his king everything he had learned. More enemies than friends. Lexi brought 2 men back with her who carried nothing with them. Concerned, Dan asked if she had run into any trouble as she introduced them.
No, but you want to hear what these 2 have to say, she said, explaining briefly.
James was young and slim, whereas the other man was big, like Kev's size. They were taken away for induction with the women, and Dan told Lexi what had happened to Joe. She was shocked and asked him if Joe was okay. He will be. I've sent him to see Marie, which is standard practice following a contact now. As of 20 minutes ago, anyway, he added subtly. Lexi didn't argue with that, having spent valuable time talking through her first killing to better come to terms with it. He told her of the farmer he had found, who should be joining them tomorrow. I still want a guard posted for when he gets here, though, he said, voicing his constant worries that they were an attractive target for others. He stowed his gear in his room, putting a bowl of food down for Ash, then went into the house. With James and Ded were 4 stressed-looking women. He was given their names, but it was done so quickly that he had no time to set them in his mind before they were breezed away for a tour. They went into Ops to speak to Steve and Leah. Dan wanted a plan before one was requested of him. He filled them in, and as he spoke, Leah got out a large-scale map of the area which had their location marked and numerous little colored dots. Joe's trip into Wales had a simple enough answer. Avoid the place. Dan assumed that the kingdom Joe spoke of would no doubt expand in the future, so he drew on a map of the area, making the limit of their journeys west about 20 miles short of the border. There was no pressing need to encroach on another large group's territory in this case. Let this lunatic take over the country for now. It would be years before it came to wars of the cattle raids that told the backstory of the neighboring countries. Lexi's trip concerned Dan far more. If people grouped together and pooled supplies for a common good, then he thought that was great. They could even trade with them in the future. If, however, people in that group were being threatened and exploited by others using force, then Dan swore to himself that it would be stopped. Slavery still had no place in the world, in his opinion, even if the laws on murder and torture were slightly more relaxed nowadays. He needed to get the 2 from their inn to be thoroughly debriefed, but gently, so as not to make them feel that they swapped one dictatorship for another. Lexi showed them the place on the map where she picked them up, an industrial area on an estuary near to a large docks and a sprawling city. Leah, he said, surprising the girl whose thoughts had wandered off. Fire up that laptop and bring up the maps. I want a better look at this place. She was excited, as she had not yet had a reason to use something that had been scavenged from a library. It was a CD version of a world atlas, archived from a time before technology gave everyone a detailed map of the world courtesy of smartphones and the internet. A couple of years out of date, maybe, but in the absence of Google Earth, It gave a much better picture with roads overlaid on the satellite imagery. Kings and militant dictatorships, Dan muttered to nobody in particular. His country just turned into tribal Africa overnight. Human resources. Penny had done her normal evening routine of welcoming the new survivors to the group, only this newest lot seemed more traumatized than previous arrivals. Maybe it was spending the winter alone and barely surviving that made them less excited, or the other survivors they had met who weren't so kind to them. Penny called the council heads to stay and invited Karen to give another rundown of the skills and capabilities as she had before. This time there was no sense of hierarchy with the women. She was just happy doing her job. The 4 women brought back by Joe were discussed first. Laura, a bank clerk in her early 30s, had seemingly held the group together and led them through winter by keeping them ahead of more unfriendly survivors. She was tough, a leader, but had no skill set to bring, really. Thoughts were invited from the group as to who wanted her. Jimmy cleared his throat. Is she the type for a bit of manual labor? I'm still down one since Kyle, left. If she's switched on and capable, I'll take her to head up another logistics crew. It was agreed to make the offer to her. Karen moved on. Melissa, 18. Should have finished A levels last year. Grew up in the country. She has expressed interest in the animals. Sold, said Chris straight away. They all knew he had more work than helping hands, and the spring would only pile more on him. Karen nodded. In that case, maybe you'll like that her close friend is almost inseparable from her. She checked her notes again. Carrie is 22 and was a biology student in her final year after a break where she traveled to South America. She has knowledge of genetics and wants to stay with Melissa if you would like her too. She looked at Chris. Definitely. She can work out breeding programs and track our herd's growth. Lovely, said Karen, who found animals quite disgusting. Dan saw the look on her face and reminded himself to scare her with his monstrosity of a dog that she liked so much when he next got the opportunity. Nina ran a small catering franchise and has a desire to stay in that line of work. I could do with some help, said Kara quickly, still slightly nervous at having a senior role to play. Moving on. Neither James nor Ed have asked for placements. James worked in a call center but did grow up shooting and fishing. Dan looked at Chris as he was the one who spoke to Pete most. Apprentice gamekeeper, he suggested. Chris was happy with the idea, as were the others. I'll take the big guy, Dan said. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but Penny interjected. It seems we have recruited our first true pacifist, she said with a soft smile. The only thing he wants no part of is violence, and it seems that his captors had wanted to recruit him into their enforcement ranks. He was beaten for refusing, even though it would have meant more food and better conditions. He refuses to hurt people on principle. Dan was shocked. It was the kind of justification he had heard from 6-stone women who didn't eat cheese as the milk was stolen from cows. He knew it wasn't the same thing, and he felt a little understanding for the man. Okay then, he said, lost for more words. Pig yapped at Chris, conveying boredom at being stuck inside, but it stirred him enough to ask if Ed would join the gardens. We've got a need for a heavy lifter, and work will pick up there soon as things need planting. Dan told them of the farmer he had met, and warned them all about his unique appearance. Chris stirred again. Welshman? He asked. Yeah. You know him? Dan said. I think so. From young farmers years ago. Hard to think there'd be 2 who look like him. Chris was happy for another experienced man on the farm and said he would see how he got on with a view to making Ewan a foreman. Penny nodded to Karen, who took it as a polite dismissal. She would go and speak to the new ones about their work. Penny started in again after Karen had left. There are concerns about where these people came from. Clearly the women were hiding from a self-styled King of Wales, but I'm assured they will not be able to follow them here." She looked at Dan, who nodded.
"Joe took care of that," he said. "He's a bit tender about it and needs to let it sink in, but he did well. The others are more of a worry."
Everyone listened in more carefully.
"I want to question James and his mate in detail, as it seems they were basically slaves in a large group where they employ enforcers to make them scavenge for them. God knows what is going on there, but I don't like it. Not one bit."
Frowns and headshakes rippled around the table. Dan went on.
"Based on what they say, I may feel the need to visit their leader and explain why slavery was abolished."
The threat hung heavy in the air as they all went away to their own thoughts. Bunker Buster. They had stepped out into the world for the first time in months to find a wasteland. Rubbish swirled around the streets. Cars lay on flat wheels covered in winter grime. Their plan to get a vehicle failed, as none were well enough preserved, resulting in a convoy of traipsing people heading for a nearby army barracks. Some of the group simply walked off alone, desperate hopes of finding loved ones running through their heads. Most of the group eventually reached the barracks, where the now delirious colonel yelled at the long-dead Ministry of Defense police barrier guard to open the gates. Some of them broke in and found the place partly ransacked. With no way of opening the weapons lockers without power, they took what they found lying around. They set themselves up in the mess area where people found what food was still edible. There was no cohesion, no leadership, and no purpose. She felt forlorn, uncomfortable in her clothes, and scared. She tried to call them to order to hear her carefully planned speech, which had actually been written by her as they walked, and not by one of her staff, as she had been used to for years now. Without a speaker to call the assembled people to order, she was ignored. One of the remaining police officers even shouted at her and called her an interfering bitch. She knew to expect such vulgarity from them. She would have wiped them all away to replace them with private companies working to government policy if she still had the power. Only now she had nothing, and the realization crushed her. She lay on the comfortable seats and rested. She coughed, the force of it getting away from her, and ended up doubling her over in a coughing fit. When she finally caught her breath and wiped the tears from her eyes, she saw them all looking at her in horrified silence. Those near her didn't even have the tact to slide away slowly. They just got up and moved quickly, giving her a stare. She felt like a leper, and her head spun as her body temperature started to rise. One by one, the rest of the group started to cough. Enter the dragon. Ewan arrived just after breakfast, driving a big Continental tractor, the kind that could do normal road speeds, and towing a large trailer. Chris met him, and the two recognized each other immediately. Ewan was offered the tour but refused, saying that he had set off before dawn and needed help bringing back machinery that they would need. All available people were tasked to go back and bring what they could. Steve drove their old minibus with a view to dumping it there and driving something more useful back. Ewan saw the scaffolding at the front of the house and asked if they were conned by some fascia salesman. The solar panel work was explained to him, and Chris admitted that it was slow progress, as the panels had to be carefully lifted one at a time.
"Bollocks, man," said Ewan. "Get that Manitou."
The big telescopic forklift on the farm was apparently called a Manitou.
"Up here and lift the whole pallet."
How that had escaped the entire engineering team was a mystery to Dan, but it seemed like the strange-looking and slightly obnoxious Welshman was going to be helpful. He smiled at the small man, giving a loud explanation of what he would do if he were building it, and walked inside. Leah was in ops, having got hold of a nervous-looking James and Ed as she was asked to. Dan sat down with them and gathered a notepad and pen close as Leah worked the map on the laptop.
"Thanks for coming in, gents,"
he started in a friendly tone.
I know this sounds silly, but you aren't in any trouble. Both relaxed slightly. You've got jobs now, I hear, he asked, to warm them up a little.
James spoke first. I've got to work with Pete and learn more about game keeping, he said. He was happy about that.
I'm going to be a gardener and grow vegetables, said Ed as happily as he could, still quite suspicious of Dan. Good stuff. If it doesn't work out or you want to learn something new instead, just ask Chris, he said, ending the ice breaking. Now, I need to know more about where you came from, and I'll be completely upfront about it. If people are keeping slaves to work for them, then I intend to put a stop to it if I can. Ed studied the man in front of him. For all his smiles, he still looked dangerous. Ed was taller and probably had 4 stone on him in weight, but he was scared of him. He had a vicious scar down the left side of his face, which Ed doubted was a shaving accident. Without doubt, this Dan was a fighter. As much as fighting upset and offended him, he wanted the others to be free too. James began telling Dan all about who was in charge and how many thugs he had with him. He told him about the shipping containers they lived in, and that they couldn't get out unless the crane lifted them. They were fed and let out to work. In the winter, they had metal barrels for fires and kept warm, but they were still prisoners. He would not think about what punishment the others had received after they didn't come back. Dan asked questions about the layout, the guards and their ships, what weapons they carried. He wanted the guns described in detail and asked insignificant questions about how the leader and the guards talked to each other, whether they used any jargon or code words, and if they had radios. This went on for over an hour as Dan wrote pages of notes. The kid, who was dressed like one of the soldiers, was working on a laptop and found the shipping yard. He studied the pictures as she gave James a big piece of blank paper and asked him to draw the place where the shipping containers were. She asked questions as Dan looked over the map, checking against a paper one as he went. The girl got James to mark where the guards stayed, where they walked, and lots of other drips of information. Their questioning finally came to an end, but before they left, Dan said, "One last thing, boys. If I go and set your friends free, I'll need you to come and convince them they are going to be safe." For maybe the 4th time during the questions, Ed spoke. "I'll come to see those people safe, but I'll not take part in anything that comes before, okay?" "Understood, Ed. Loud and clear," Dan replied. Dan and Leah were left alone. He went over his notes and let out a sigh. Leah looked at him, and he summarized. 30+ survivors kept as slaves. Up to 20 guards with a range of weapons, including at least 5 shotguns, a rifle, and 2 semi-automatic pistols. High ground approach, but to a dead end. He stopped and rubbed his face, scratching the stiff scar down his left eye. "This isn't going to be easy, kid," he said.
"You'll figure it out. You always do," she said helpfully. "I'll make a model of their camp," she declared as she skipped off to find Marie, who was teaching her how to draw in their sessions.
"Oh, if I had your faith in me," he said to himself as Boris jumped onto his notes and hissed at him. Hot showers. With help from Ewan over the next week, the pitched roof was now mostly covered on both sides by solar panels. 8 metal tanks lined the apex, all firmly connected to the scaffolding frame, which was being secured wherever they could. Pipes ran down to the 2 bathrooms and the kitchen, where Adam had fitted new taps. Heavy wires wrapped in rolls of tape snaked back up, powering the battery bank, which in turn fed electricity to the house. Mike said it wasn't an endless supply and suggested a further scaffold tower or 2 be erected on the flat ground near the house. More materials were required for this, as well as a smaller but similar setup for the farm and gardens, and teams were deployed to recover what he needed. The big win was what Adam and Carl had done. The rainwater reservoir tanks fitted to the guttering system now filled the uppermost floor of the house,
and the newly fitted electric showers, 3 in each bathroom, were ready for use.
Marie was the most excited, claiming she hadn't washed her hair properly for nearly a year,
and organized an official opening ceremony. A ribbon was found and cut in light-hearted mockery of their old lives, and the queues went along the corridor. Neil had to use the generators to boost the power supply, as the solar panels hadn't yet had a chance to fully charge the batteries. Dan was amazed at how the small things in life, like a hot shower, made everyone happy. Happy was good. Happy was productive. The new hands made the farming and gardening tasks much easier. They had 4 polytunnels of potatoes growing and a handful of other vegetables which could be grown early. Ewan had been a godsend in that respect, as he brought sacks of moldy potatoes sprouting lank shoots, and they had gone in the ground to make a new crop. His return trips had also yielded pigs, a cockerel, and some chickens, and more cows, as well as some pieces of farm machinery which made work quicker. The general feeling was good, and people went about their daily routines with a smile. Dan brooded, saving his own thoughts of the impending conflict for only a few who knew what he was planning. His rangers went out, scouting the things he needed. He tried different scenarios out in his head, calculating problems and losses. That was the issue. He couldn't serve up a plan to the council which allowed for any losses. He theorized with Steve over Leah's cardboard model. They pored over the maps and suggested different plans of attack which the others were invited to criticize. Leah surprised him by saying, "Why don't you just go and ask them to let the people go?" The stunned silence was broken by Steve laughing. Leah looked annoyed and snapped at him. "That's just the start, but if you're going to laugh, then I won't tell you." Dan looked at her more closely. She had an idea, and she had the balls to offer it in their company. "Run me through it, kid," he said. War games. "Drive straight up to the gate and ask to talk to their boss," she explained. "You'll have top cover here and here," she said impatiently, pointing at 2 marks on her model. "All of the people we want to rescue will be inside metal containers, so they won't get shot by accident," she said, as though she spoke to a child in a weird role reversal. "If they say no, then you shoot the guards on top, never more than 8 to 10, and deal with the rest coming from where their building is." She was annoyed because it was the 5th time she had talked him through it step by step. He thought about it.
"How do we know they'll all be there?"
he asked. She flipped the laptop around, showing her now typed notes of the debrief. "No night activity, and all guards sleep in an adjacent building, bar the ones watching the pen. We get there for sunrise, and they'll be there," she finished with a triumphant look. Dan looked to the other rangers sitting around the table.
"Leah," he said carefully, "do you realize your plan involves killing 20 or so people?"
"Yes, but they aren't nice people, and they aren't coming to live here." He couldn't argue with her logic, but he worried that he may have created a monster.
"How am I supposed to deal with more than 10 people rushing out shooting at me, even assuming that the ones on guard duty have been shot?" he asked, fearing the answer.
"Machine gun, and the back of a truck like in the films," she said with finality.
He hated to admit it, but she had come up with a simple plan which had every possibility of working. Their plans all fell down when they tried to extract scared people without confronting their captors.
"There's a lot more to it, but fundamentally I think she's right," said Steve carefully. Leah practically burst with smug pride.
"Okay, everyone think on it, but keep it to yourselves," Dan said as they left.
He called Steve back and asked him if he thought Leah was too quick to suggest killing.
"I haven't pushed her too far, have I?"
he asked. Steve had spent a lot of time with her as her training progressed and knew her well. "No, she's looking at this as a problem to be solved using what we have. She was never constrained by rules of engagement before and never will be now. She's not a psychopath. She's being pragmatic like you.
albeit a little cold. Dan laughed. Mount the GPMG in the back of a truck like in the films. What's she been watching? Steve laughed with him and poured 2 glasses from the bottle he retrieved from a drawer. It has its merits and is entirely doable. Personally, I'd like more evidence that they are actually mistreating people. I'd like eyes on myself, ideally. Me too. But the risk is too high, said Dan as he sipped. I'll work it out and see if Neil can weld a tripod into a defender. In the meantime, train her hard tomorrow. She's getting cocky. His head swam with possible tweaks to a plan, but essentially she was right. Get everyone in place, demand they release the people, and kill them if they didn't. They still had to then calm and rescue the people inside and take responsibility for them. After all, they had been dependent on the bastards for food and shelter, and probably wouldn't know how to look after themselves. He was planning to kill 20 and bring back over 30. What if they didn't want to be here? What if they wanted to stay where they were? What if some of them knew the guards or were related to them? After breakfast, Dan walked outside with Ash. It was just about warm enough for shirt sleeves, but his body armor gave him another layer. He smoked as he walked up to the farm to find Neil in his workshop.
"What you been?"
said Neil cheerfully from under the bonnet of a Defender he was servicing. Ash ran to him and sniffed his pockets until he gave up his work, giggling, and tossed him a treat. Neil always had some on him, as the group now had 4 dogs. All of them liked him, which was no surprise at all based on the contents of his pockets. Hypothetical question, mate, Dan said, getting a well-deserved skeptical look. Is it possible to mount the GPMG on a Land Rover? Of course it's possible, but this ain't Desert Bloody Storm. What the hell are you planning, mate? Dan's mind flashed to pictures of the Pinkies with GPMGs on each side and a .50 caliber in the back. He didn't keep secrets from Neil and trusted him not to gossip. I want to rescue those people to the south, and we don't have the numbers to take them on conventionally. We need to surprise them with overwhelming force, he said. He ran through the basics of Leah's plan and told him what he imagined for the heavy gun. Neil mulled it over. That's a bit cold-blooded, isn't it? He asked. Dan told him it was a teenage girl who suggested it. You've cloned yourself, Neil laughed, then faded off to his thoughts. If you're serious, I can do it. I need a long wheelbase pickup with a removable tin back, like the farm ones. Done, said Dan, and he left Neil to his tinkering.
"Bring that flash disco of yours in for an oil change, too,"
Neil shouted after him. Dan walked through the farm, keeping Ash close. He saw Chris and Ewan deep in conversation by a large lean-to, basically a 3-sided barn where the spare vehicles had been stored. Pig saw them first and bounced over to play with Ash and lick at his face until he swatted a huge paw at her and played. She was small for a collie, not much bigger than Pete's cockers, but considering her early life, she was lucky to be alive. She always stayed close to Chris with an unquestioning loyalty. Dan spoke with them for a while, hearing their plans for the farm over the coming years. Chris seemed awkward after Ewan left them, and asked Dan, "What's this I'm hearing about a rescue mission?" He wasn't entirely shocked that people had talked, but was certain it hadn't come from his rangers, so people wouldn't know how they planned to do it. I'm going to suggest it, yes. Our cattle are kept better than they are from what we've heard. Chris was pleased and offered any help he could provide. I might need everyone who knows how to use a shotgun to stand guard if we all go. I think I'll need all the rangers on this one, Dan said. No problem, Chris replied, meaning it. Dan was happy with the support and reckoned any future coup attempts would fail based on his popularity. He lit another smoke and wandered towards the sound of single rounds being fired from a rifle. He found Steve drilling Leah on their makeshift range, which was framed by high banks on each side and dead ground in front. Steve had done well, making scarecrow-type targets in between the trees. As Dan approached, they spotted him and stopped. They seemed to be having an intense conversation, and as he got to them, Steve asked if Leah could demonstrate her current exercise. She beamed at Dan under the weight of her vest, with the G36 hung across her chest. Dan looked at her for a while before saying, "Continue." He called Ash to him and walked back a short way. Steve stood ready with his stopwatch as Leah drove in a lazy circle to come back to the range. As she neared, he yelled, "Contact!" and started the clock. She slammed the brakes on the vehicle and slid away from the driver's door to drop to the ground. She appeared under the open door and fired 2 rounds from the G36 into the closest dummy, one in the chest, one in the head. She rolled to the side and rose to her knee, where she fired 2 more into the next dummy. Again, her accuracy was good. She ran forward 10 meters and dropped to one knee again. Steve yelled, "Stoppage!" So she dropped the carbine to hang at her chest while she drew the Glock as she simulated a weapon jam. She rose as she fired 2 more rounds, slower this time, but still as lethally accurate, then advanced at a crouch. "Reload! Clear primary weapon!" Steve shouted. Leah dropped to her knee again, holstering the pistol. She dropped the magazine from the carbine and racked the slide 3 times before seating a fresh magazine and pushing it home. She chambered around and called out, "Reloaded!" then stood and stalked to the end of the range using available cover to good effect. On approaching the final dummy, Steve shouted, "Automatic fire!" prompting Leah to duck into cover and make herself small. Steve then called, "Enemy reloading!" and Leah popped out to fire 5 rounds into the last target. "Stop! Stop! Stop!" Steve called. Leah made her weapons safe and ran back for debriefing. She was barely out of breath. 29 seconds, 4 enemies down, no injury, Steve declared. Both looked at Dan. "I am impressed," Dan said with a genuine smile as he walked towards them. "Why 5 rounds in the last target?" he asked. "No clear line of sight for headshot. 4 shots to the center mass until I got line of sight," she barked like a Marine Corps recruit. Dan really was impressed. That little girl was becoming quite the capable killer. "What's your time?" she asked in an innocent voice which oozed with challenge. He thought about it for a while, then decided to humor her. "Let's find out," he said, taking the G36 and a spare magazine. He thought through the exercise and decided on a different approach. "I'm not that familiar with this weapon, so that's my excuse if you beat me," he said jokingly. He climbed into the Defender, put the seat back about 2 feet, and drove a loop as Leah had. Steve called the start of the contact, and Dan accelerated hard to the range. He skidded to a stop and took out the first 2 dummies with a single headshot as he rounded the Defender's door. He ran forward, and when the weapon jam was called, he fired a double tap from his SIG into the dummy before taking the position it was in. He cleared and reloaded quickly, then stood and stalked along the left side to the next piece of cover. On being told he was under automatic fire, he took cover and dropped to the floor. The instant the reloading call came, he rose and fired into the head of his last remaining target. He strolled back to Leah and handed over the weapon. She looked at Steve, hoping. 19 seconds, Steve said, keeping his face neutral and hiding the smile that threatened to emerge. Leah looked dismayed. He hadn't done that to humiliate her, she knew that, but she felt like she was being taught a lesson. "Cheer up, kid. At 13, I would have shot my toes off," Dan said kindly. He bent down to her. "Seriously, Leah, you're good. Really good. Keep it up and you can have my job soon." She smiled her biggest grin before Steve told her to sprint to the farm and back before cleaning the weapons. She ran away, feigning annoyance, but actually very happy. "There's a big difference when they shoot back, mate," Dan said tiredly to Steve. "We both know that," Steve said. "I just wish she didn't have to find out one day." No escape. She lay there and coughed all night. It wasn't a normal cough. It was a deep, chesty cough that racked her whole body into convulsions and went on endlessly, leaving her breathless and weak. Her skin burned and her head pounded. She cried during the brief respite and tried to breathe in shallow gasps so as not to aggravate the cough again. Each one was worse than the last, and her heart beat so fast she thought it would burst. She had no idea how long she had been like that. All measure of time was lost in the endless cycle of pain and delirium. Effectively, that was what happened to her the next day when she was too sick to move anywhere. Others were in the room with her, but they were trapped inside their own failing bodies too. During a coughing episode, the pressure on her cardiovascular system became so intense that the multiple hemorrhages in her system caused too much clotting for her weakened body to deal with. She suffered a fatal heart attack and died within 48 hours of exposure to the poisoned air. Two of the group who had been allowed into the bunker, seemingly to rebuild their country and its infrastructure when the infection burned itself out, survived past the 48-hour mark without any symptoms. The junior medical lab assistant Emma sat alone talking to herself. At first glance, you would think that she had seen too much, and the trauma had caused her grip on reality to weaken. It hadn't. She sat with her eyes closed and visualized her lab as she spoke her notes out loud into a small digital voice recorder. Infection through airborne means is most likely due to the lack of other visible means of transmission. Very fast gestation period, ranging from 10 to 14 hours. Death followed within 34 hours of visible symptoms to all subjects monitored. Other subjects available for monitoring left the test area during gestation. She opened her eyes and looked at the array of bodies who had died in front of her as she walked between them, making observations and notes. 2 subjects out of 29 remain unaffected. Based on the available and very limited data, I can extrapolate no common denominator to establish a basis for immunity. Gender, age range, ethnicity, physical size, and appearance are effectively opposite in both surviving subjects. She stopped recording and looked sadly at the other survivor. The colonel had gone downhill significantly since people started to show signs of infection. He had ranted loudly about being the last high-ranking army officer left, making him commander-in-chief. He shouted at the bodies, giving his authority to launch tactical missiles at Russian cities immediately before ordering further strikes on China. On seeing the lab assistant watching him, he began to scream that she was a Chinese spy and ordered her to be arrested immediately. She wasn't Chinese. She was part Korean and had never actually been there. But she was sure that it would be a waste of time to explain this. She left him to his solitary war and monitored the others who had not survived. She took a small rucksack from the possessions of a soldier who would no longer have need of it, collecting similarly useful items from everyone and closing their eyes when required. She sorted her small pile into order and packed her rucksack, including the blessedly thin and light laptop and its charger, useless without power, knowing that battery life must be preserved until another source was found. She carefully wrapped it inside a zip-topped plastic bag to protect the contents. She readied herself to sleep in another room not occupied by dead people. She did not feel brave enough to travel at night and planned to leave in the morning. She would have to leave the colonel so as not to be shot on sight for the crime of looking a bit Chinese. Thunderbird 2. Dan had spent 2 days scouting and recovering the things he needed. He had found a coach company and managed to start an almost brand new vehicle which was stored inside a large weatherproof unit. Ian was recruited to drive it, and it was now parked on the road by the farm. Steve had found a high-capacity Defender pickup truck, a 130 wheelbase with 3 seats up front. Neil had gone over it mechanically first, then started on the tubular steelwork in the back. He had brought Mike in to consult, and a series of flexible rubber mounts were fashioned to stop the machine gun from shaking itself loose. Dan's additions to Leah's plan involved Steve and Lexi acting as snipers, and for that he needed them accurate over 350 meters minimum. The sights of the newer semi-automatic rifles were swapped out for more powerful optics, and in the absence of heavier weapons, they practiced with their new HK-416s. Dan was worried that he would have to rely on Joe to fire the big gun. But Neil was the only person other than himself who had ever even seen one fired before, let alone used one. He told Dan as much, and said he was coming. He would hear no argument against, and Dan didn't try too hard. He was glad to have Neil with him if this went down. On their first day of sniper training, Steve declared the 416s to be inadequate. "It's not the accuracy, it's the weight of the round," he explained. "To guarantee a kill at the distance you're looking at, we need bigger guns." Dan considered the heavier of the hunting rifles, but these only held a few rounds and were bolt action. He thought for a while, then turned to Lexi. "Clean and stow the HKs and remove the optics. Put the holographic sights back on, please," he said, then turned to Steve. "Remember that army camp you went 2 years ago for your E&D training?" He did. "Good. We're going in 10 minutes. Return trip. Dan drove hard as Steve scanned the countryside. Ash nosed his now huge snout through the gap between their seats, and when Steve gave him a sideways look, his tongue slashed out like a viper to drench his face with sticky dog drool. Steve told Ash exactly how much he enjoyed it and was answered with a short growl. He leaned over closer to his window for the remainder of the journey. They arrived there by lunchtime, drove straight through the gate and into the camp after a drive-by check. Dan navigated them between the buildings back to where he found the soldier. He told Steve the story on the way there, explaining that he had wished he could bury the man, but had an unshakable feeling that he was being watched. He felt much better now he had a well-trained pair of eyes watching his back. Not that Ash wasn't good backup, but he had yet to master using a carbine. "Well, that explains this exotic piece, then," Steve surmised, patting the rare short-barreled SPAS shotgun resting on the dash where it sat when it wasn't on Dan's back. They got out of the Discovery quickly as it stopped. Vehicles attracted fire, Dan remembered being told repeatedly when he was younger. They fanned out each side to find hard cover, scanning all around looking for any sign of danger. There was none, but neither of them fully relaxed. "People probably know what this place is, and who was based here," Dan said. "But I doubt they know where they keep the good stuff," Steve finished for him. "There's more guns here than West Africa." "I'm happy with these ones," said Dan as he moved carefully forward, Ash stalking by his side. "But more rounds and some heavier tours would be nice." He followed Steve through buildings, past where the suicidal soldier's boots were still visible, eventually stopping by the unremarkable door of an unremarkable building. The electronic keypad and swipe card system was long since rendered useless, but brute force was making a comeback. They spent some time using their master key to cut a squarish hole in the thick layered metal, planning to use Neil's patented door-opening piece. He hadn't yet named his invention, and Dan thought of dubbing it the swipe card. He looked at the reinforced door, then at his still attractively unique discovery. Not wanting to risk damaging it, he suggested that they find a disposable vehicle to use. They took a diesel jerrycan and starter pack on a hunt, both setting eyes on a large Unimog at the same time. Dan smiled. These things would go places which would embarrass their own fleet of Land Rovers. "Yes, please," Steve said. He tinkered with it for a while, with no joy. They had to drag a generator from the vehicle workshop nearby and attach a long set of jump leads to the battery. After spraying some flammable engine starter from an aerosol can into the air filter, a trick of Neil's, the huge Mercedes engine barked and struggled into renewed life. They scanned around for evidence that the noise hadn't alerted anyone, and when they felt comfortable, they turned back to their new addition. Although technically the short wheelbase version, this was basically a very capable off-road militarized lorry. They checked it over, and it even had a weapon mount above the three-person cab. The back was like a large high-sided skip, with sides thick enough to be safe from small arms fire. It was filthy, but it was a very good find. This is too goddamned cool to leave behind, said Dan. Steve grinned at him. Don't you mean too valuable? Yeah, that too, he replied. Now let's get those tires pumped up. They used the generator to power a compressor, having found the tire pressures indicated on a helpful sticker in the driver's door frame. There were 2 spares in the back, luckily. They would never have loaded them without a forklift. Steve revved the huge engine, making Dan smile again. He slowly eased it towards the armory door with the creaks and mechanical moans of being unused loud in the air. It was backed up, and the heavy chain fixed to the towing hitch. On the other end was Neil's swipe guard, effectively a folding anchor made of heavy steel. They posted it through and heard the loud metallic thud of it hitting the concrete floor below. Dan hoped it would hold, as it was designed for slightly less resistance than reinforced steel. Flashes of his training came back to him. An expensive door lock is only as strong as the 16 screws holding the hinges into the wood. He hoped the chain was strong enough to do the job, as it wasn't wood screws he was trying to break here. He gave Steve a thumbs up as Steve climbed into the cab of the Unimog, revving the engine and creeping forwards to take up the slack. Dan ran clear, calling Ash away with him. The chain clanked and creaked under the growing pressure, each knotted link snapping into place with enough force to sever a carelessly placed finger. Steve gunned the big diesel again and again until the steel door gave its first sign of weakness. It buckled outwards slightly at the same time as a large chunk of concrete fell away. Steve knew what he was doing, and Dan doubted that anyone he knew had the same deft foot control as a helicopter pilot. Steve relaxed the pressure on the clutch slightly, allowing the pressure to ease on the door for a second before he lifted the pedal again, faster this time. More of the door surround fell away with each movement as Steve made each pull faster and harder than the last. Eventually, with a noise like metallic thunder audible over the huge straining engine, the concrete split and the door fell away with a loud bang. The massive vehicle shot forward and bounced on its suspension, then stalled. Steve tried to fire it up again, but it would only let out a wheezing noise as it refused to turn over. He got out, full of sadness. Dan felt the same. He would have loved having the truck for a number of justifiable reasons. Priorities. They allowed the dust to settle before moving into the armory. Dan had put Ash in the Discovery with the windows open. He was likely to hurt himself on the rubble, but could still sound a warning. They tentatively entered, searching the dusty air with the bright torches mounted on their weapons. "Clear," said Steve, who had taken the lead. "Now, nothing silly like a .50 caliber. We need to find a few decent rifles and a boot full of 7.62. The racks of weaponry in front of him were immense, row upon row of different weapons, some modified and others stock. Dan took a large armful of Remington pump-action shotguns, easy to use, reliable, and capable of being used for hunting, blowing door hinges away, or cutting bad people in half. They searched, resisting the urge to take everything. There were so many weapons neither of them recognized, some bearing Cyrillic or Oriental markings. A rack of rifles looked promising, and Steve crowed at their successes. He had found 3 new MK-14s, the American-made enhanced battle rifle with a full-length rail and skeleton stocks. They were painted in tan coloring over the black underneath. These types of rifle had been popular for some time now, designed to bridge the gap between frontline and snipers. A kind of specialist middle ground killer. They fired a heavy caliber bullet from a 10 or 20 round magazine on semi-automatic. Perfect for what they wanted, and lethal up to a kilometer away, if you were skilled enough to put the bullet in the right place. A true sniper took years to perfect the art of long-distance shooting, of studying the physics required to thread the metaphorical needles. They searched every inch to look for ammunition for them, eventually only finding a few empty spare magazines. Dan ran his eyes along the racks again, ignoring the weird, wonderful, and exotic. He took another few M4s, all that remained in the rack, and put them with his stash of shotguns.
Steve called him through to another room, which was decked out like a workshop with bench-mounted tools along one side. There were suppressors and optics lined up, and Steve selected 3 of the bulbous telescopic sights which amplified light. They also grabbed small bipods, vertical and adjustable foregrips, and shorter-range sights like the holographic red dots on some of their other guns. Steve grabbed everything he could, excitedly throwing all of it into boxes. Dan carried on until he found the next room stocked with various ammunition types. They filled his Land Rover with crates of heavy ammunition and shotgun cartridges. They filled the remaining space with 5.56. Although they had lots of it at home, it would run out eventually. Steve came back in and saw that they still had a lot more ammunition to take, but no space to carry it. He ran back to the Unimog and desperately tried again to start it. He bucked it forwards in gear until it finally caught and started. Dan's joy was short-lived as it died again instantly and began to steam from under the bonnet. "It's fucked," said Steve unhappily. Dan stated that he was well aware of that, then looked at Steve and said, "Trailer." They walked back to the vehicle workshop and found a trailer. Its tires were flat and they had to drag it closer to pump them up using the generator and compressor. They wheeled it back to the Discovery and loaded all the boxes of ammunition they could find. On the final sweep, Dan found a box of small suppressors, which he tried to attach to his SIG. They didn't fit, and he looked around the handguns for one that did, throwing everything he could find into boxes. They loaded every crate of ammunition they could find into the trailer until a bark from the Land Rover snapped Dan's attention back to the present. Dan suddenly felt that familiar sense of dread as he did last time. Unwilling to push their luck any further, he shouted to Steve, "Time to go." They drove towards home, eyes constantly scanning for danger. Their CB was finally in range of the house when they crested high ground about 15 miles out, getting Leah on the other end. "You've been ages," she moaned at them. "People are starting to worry."
"Tell them we're fine, and we'll be home soon," he said, driving onwards. The hard sell. They had brought back so much ammunition that Dan lost most of his room to store it. He thought that maybe it was time he established an armory in there and moved to another bedroom. Maybe there was one near Marie's room. He forced himself to think productively and not daydream. He had the workings of a plan and the tools to execute it. It needed some rehearsal and fine-tuning, but a lot depended on what the opposition decided to do. Neil had fitted the big machine gun into the mount and test-fired 50 rounds in short bursts on the range. He showed Dan how he had fitted the metal truck back with rubber loops, allowing him to unclip them silently from inside. He had attached a pole to the front so that when he lifted it, the whole cover flipped over backwards and exposed the machine gun. Steve and Lexi had stripped and oiled the rifles, and each fired a further 50 rounds to sight their huge optics and practice. They were ready to go at 400 meters, easily inside the range where the wind or atmosphere would be a serious issue for aiming. At that distance, they would drop a human like they were water. Now came the big problem of convincing the council to endorse his plan, as this was too big an issue to decide by himself. He called a meeting, having spoken to James and some others in advance for support. After dinner, all departmental heads gathered at his request, and he laid out the groundwork. "As you may know, the place where James and Ed were found is under the control of a man who calls himself Bronson. I'm told the name stems from what he does to people who disagree with his methods. I won't bore you with second-hand details of his atrocities, but with your permission, I'd like to bring James in to share some of what he saw." Dan looked around the room, receiving nods all around, and the mood took a darker feel. He called James loudly by name, and the nervous young man came in. "Thank you, James," he said. "You know why you're here, so please tell us what living conditions you suffered and what punishments were dished out by this Bronson." James seemed nervous, but he had been well coached in which bits to highlight.
They kept us in metal shipping containers in a circle so we couldn't get out unless they lowered the crane to us. That's how they got us out to work, and how they put in food and water and the buckets for..." He trailed off.
"What work did they make you do?"
asked Dan. "Fetching food for them, carrying things around. That was the men anyway," he replied. "What did they make the women do?" Kate asked in a measured voice to control the anger of the obvious answer. "Cook, clean, and..." James faltered. "And what, man? Please, speak up," said Penny, softening her snap with a reassuring smile. "Bronson said his boys need entertaining. He uses the girls to entertain them. Some of them bring food and drink back to share with the others afterwards," he finished. Enough said on that point.
"The punishments. Tell us about the punishments,"
said Dan. James's face creased slightly. "They'll have punished the others because we ran. I don't know what he would have done, but it won't have been nice. He made us all watch him cut out a man's tongue for shouting at him once. He made another man, a boy really, fight him because he stood up to him to protect a girl. He beat him to death in front of us."
"You say he fed and watered you.
"Was it enough?" asked Neil, secretly part of the plan to endorse the mission. "No. Some people fought over it, saying they should have it. A few of those, Bronson lifted out and made them guards. Ed got a few beatings for trying to make sure everyone got a share. When they saw he was big enough to take it, they offered him a job carrying stuff for them. That's how he got me out with him to work where Lexi found us," he said.
"What about your living condition? How many people are we talking about?"
asked Chris, also secretly on side thanks to Neil. "There were over 30 of us to start with. 3 people died in the winter. They got sick and never got better." "No medical care?" asked Kate angrily. "No. They thought it might be the bug that killed everyone and didn't let anyone out for a few days," James said sadly. "One girl died of an asthma attack." Nobody spoke, and Dan asked the council if they had any further questions for him. They didn't.
"Thanks, James. Would you please ask Leah to come in?"
he said. He left, and Leah entered full of confidence, carrying a model of the area as described by James. She laid it on the table and looked at Dan hopefully.
"Thanks. Now go enjoy your evening,"
he said, disappointing her with the dismissal. He didn't want her letting anything slip. As the door closed, he turned to the assembled heads and asked,
"Are there any objections to a rescue mission at this point?"
Nobody spoke. He was sure the objections would come thick and fast soon.
"This is the area James described," he began. "As you can see, it is heavily fortified, and a stealth approach has been ruled out due to the geography. I propose to visit the camp and speak to the leader. If diplomacy fails, and let's be realistic here, it probably will, a plan to remove the captives by force is available."
He looked at the council and received blank stares from some, nods of encouragement from others.
"This is a big operation and holds equally big risks. I want this to be a vote, but I want everyone to be clear about why I want to do it. Humanity must prevail, and with that we must save people from a system that uses slavery and brutality for the benefit of the few," Dan said, launching into his prepared speech about doing the right thing. "2 of my rangers will be placed here and here," he said, indicating nearby buildings. "I will approach in a vehicle I have prepared for a confrontation." As agreed, he left out Neil's involvement for now, so he didn't seem complicit. Democracy was all well and good, but he liked to hedge his bets. "Should they not release the prisoners, the snipers will deal with the guards on top of the containers. I will have to deal with the remaining hostiles coming from this building here," he said, again pointing to a part of the model. "How many are we talking about, mate?" asked Chris. Up to 20. I plan to be there at dawn, so they will all be inside and probably still drunk, Dan replied with some trepidation. All part of the plan.
Can you handle that many? Neil asked, full of rehearsed concern.
I'll have to. Nobody else can work the machine gun, he said, easing into the sticky part of the plan.
Snipers. Machine gun, said Penny. Is it safe to assume that you plan to kill these guards and Bronson?
Yes, I do. It's true that I'm the violent one here, and sadly, that is my skill set. I can't grow things or make things or heal people, but I have used my abilities to keep every single one of you alive. I want to save these people, and I'm asking you all to allow me to take our rangers and a few others to bring back 30-plus people who deserve better, and to stop a tyrant before he is too powerful to deal with. What if we ignore this now, and next year he knocks on our door to take what he wants?
It's too dangerous, said Penny. Your plan is obviously flawed, as you will never have time to use the machine gun if they are watching you. Neil cleared his throat. Actually, I'm the only one here to have ever used one. I'll go with you.
I can't let you do that, Dan began, but Neil cut him off harshly.
I was using them when you were still in school, so don't tell me what you can and can't let me do, he said, keeping his face stern and staring Dan into submission.
In that case, the plan will work much better and faster, Dan said with carefully feigned resignation. He looked to Chris and Kate in turn.
Yes, said Chris. Absolutely, said Kate.
Kara looked apprehensive.
I'm worried our people, will get killed, she said nervously. I agree, said Andrew with uncharacteristic confidence. I don't know. It seems very dangerous to have all the Rangers leave at once, said Jimmy, giving Penny some glimmer of support. He moved to Penny. I'm concerned for the welfare of everyone. It's not just you risking your own life again. If you all go and get yourselves killed, then what about everyone else? She began. That said, I could not allow my conscience to rest knowing that we did nothing. You must promise that you will seek a diplomatic solution first, though.
Trust me, I will. Are we all agreed then?
They were. Dan hid his smile and reminded himself to do some extra washing up for Kara and share a beer with Jimmy for playing their parts. If everyone supported him publicly, then Penny would feel alone enough to argue against the plan in justifiably good conscience. Operation Eggshell. Why is it called that? Leah interrupted for the third time since he started talking.
Because we need to tread lightly. Now stop talking over me or I'll tell Ash you're edible, he said, snarling. He loved that sarcastic little girl, but she really knew how to piss him off at times. Anyway, thanks to everyone here for volunteering. As you know, nobody will be forced to do this, Dan said as he addressed the assembled team. Steve, Joe, and Lexi at the front, Neil, Ian, James, and Ed behind. Leah had nagged to be allowed to go, but Dan had flatly refused. He would be too busy to watch over her, as would the other Rangers. He had to compromise by allowing her to be armed when they went, under Chris's careful eye, as he would be nominally in charge of house protection during the mission. You've all heard where we are going and why we are going there, so I won't go over the whys and wherefores again, except to say that our purpose is to rescue survivors being kept prisoner. We will be setting off long before dawn tomorrow to be in place by sunrise. Lexi and Steve know their insertion points and will be providing cover throughout. Neil and I will be in the modified Land Rover, stopping short for him to get in the back. Ian will drive the coach with Ed and James to reassure the people we are rescuing, and they will stop a couple of miles short under Joe's protection until called in via CB. Reminder, there will be no radio traffic until the threats are dealt with. He paused to make sure they got the point, repeating the instruction carefully, word for word, out of habit. I will drive to the site and talk to them. If it needs to go noisy, I will indicate for the snipers to open fire with a hand signal as agreed. Neil will then unveil the machine gun, and I will crawl under the Land Rover screaming and try not to get shot. His joke got the nervous laugh it deserved. Snipers will stay in place until extraction, then fall back and regroup at the agreed site before we return home in convoy.
Just in time for tea and medals, declared Wing Commander Neil.
Penny and the others had not been idle. Bedding and clothing packs had been prepared, and the second-level dormitories were cleared and fresh bedding laid out. Kara had spent the 2 days since the meeting baking cakes and pastries, as Nina maintained the commercial cooking side effectively. Kate had laid out a triage area and had a set of hospital scrubs ready for each of her team. Marie and Penny were standing by to welcome the new arrivals and organize them with all those not busy on the farms. Get some sleep. Alarm clock set for 2 a.m. He nodded dismissal to the group and turned to see Leah's face set in a stone mask of neutrality, which she had adopted since being told to be quiet. "What's the matter with you?" he asked. Leah fixed him with an evilly fake smile, replying in a sweet voice,
"Nothing."
Dan didn't sleep, but that was fairly normal for him. Just after midnight, he took Ash outside and then went into ops and loaded 4 of the new Remington shotguns which had been stored in his room. Chris would distribute these as he saw fit, and Dan trusted him to make the right choices. He checked over all the equipment he was taking, but left the personal weapons of the other Rangers, as he wouldn't like someone tampering with his. It messed up a person's chi. He was restless and ready by 1 a.m., waiting for the others. They trickled down one by one in silence, but were all early. As they were preparing to go, Leah stumbled in, looking sleepy, but carrying 2 flasks of coffee. She must have got up early to boil the water. She gave one to Dan and kept the second for herself, making him wonder when she had started drinking coffee. More bad parenting, he assumed. But wasn't like he had got her an appropriate present for her birthday. She pulled on her vest and took a Glock and carbine, checking both chambers and making sure they were safe before adding sugar to her drink. That was good. A sleepy teenager demonstrating weapon discipline when half asleep. He went to go, and a grunt from her made him turn back. She walked over and tentatively put her arms around him, unsure of herself. He hugged her back tighter, and she simply said, "See you later," then turned to switch on the CB to monitor their progress. Dan led the convoy with Neil sitting beside him. He had left Ash behind, not wanting to risk him being hit in the hail of bullets he anticipated, or biting a refugee. They didn't speak, save to look behind and say that they still had their convoy. Lexi and Steve followed, with Ian driving the coach stocked with food and water, and Joe behind. They took the route Lexi had followed, knowing it to be clear, going at a steady speed so Ian could easily keep pace. They went like this for over 3 hours, until Dan pulled up at the point where Ian's coach and Joe would wait for word that it was safe to move up. Dan drank a coffee and rehearsed exactly how he wanted it to go, then factored in what could go wrong. Lexi and Steve left after 30 minutes, creeping towards their posts on goggles to save using vehicle lights. He had insisted on radio silence in case the other group had a CB and were monitoring it. Slim chance, but his paranoid way avoided the possibility that they would be the ones ambushed and not the other way around. Another hour went by, and the sun started to creep onto the horizon. His snipers should be in place by now. He felt good to have them there. He trusted them, and both owed their lives to him. He willed himself to be calm and went over and over the variables. He finally admitted 2 things to himself. 1, he had no intention of allowing this pack of bastards and their psycho leader to live. And 2, he realized all the people with him trusted their own lives, and that of the prisoners, on his ability to wing it. He looked at Neil, who looked as anxious as he felt inside. "We're doing this?" Neil asked.
10 minutes, Dan replied, looking at the first rays of sun in the distance. 10 minutes came and went in silence. Dan started the engine. Neil quietly recited some part of a speech from Gladiator before winking and climbing out. Noises from the back and a gentle double thump on the thin bulkhead between them let Dan know that Neil was ready. "Showtime," Dan said quietly to himself before setting off with his lights on full beam. Make it rain. He arrived at the camp in a few minutes, seeing a dirty, multicolored replica of Leah's white model. He rolled in slowly, saying through the bulkhead to Neil, 30 seconds. The muffled reply of Roger came back with a jaunty roll of the letter R. Dan drove closer, just as the sun was up over his left shoulder. He saw a flurry of movement on top of the curious array of shipping containers. Then, as the low building to his right came into view, he skewed the nose of the Land Rover to the left to give Neil a better arc of fire. He got out of the vehicle, wearing clothes that made him not look like himself. He had gray trousers on and a bright-colored T-shirt scavenged from the camping shop months ago. He called a hello to the visible guard and received a string of obscene abuse back. He decided to adopt the idiot approach, which annoyed him that people always found believable, and tried again. Just his luck. Bronson was awake. Dan was thrown for an instant. He recovered in time to assess the big man walking towards him. He had the inescapable look of an ex-pro heavyweight boxer, his hands big enough to choke the life out of a grown man. Bronson was intimidating before he saw him, but now Dan was properly scared and considered ordering his troops to open up immediately. He gathered his nerves and tried to play the idiot for a little while longer.
"Hello there,"
he said cheerfully with a fake lisp.
"Haven't seen anyone in days now. I'm Eric,"
he said, offering a hand. He didn't look like an Eric, and Bronson didn't accept the hand. "What do you want, little man?" Bronson growled. Not many people could say that to him with any degree of accuracy, but Bronson was right. The man was a monster. Every second Dan waited, the sun climbed higher in the sky, making the targets easier for his team. It also gave time for the other enemies inside to get organized. He decided to speed things along.
"I've heard you have people in there. I'd like to take them off your hands,"
he said, knowing that without the snipers and Neil, he had just signed his own, and likely very painful, death warrant. "You want to take them, do you?" Bronson said in a voice dripping with dangerous menace. "Then fucking take them, runt. Right now. Or call for the fucking cavalry to come and save your arse, because I will rip you to pieces."
"Okay, but I want you to bring your people out to watch me beat you. Fair fight. You and me,"
Dan replied, feigning a confidence he didn't possess in the slightest. Bronson smiled at him. "You!" he shouted as he turned and pointed at a half-drunk guard. "Everyone out here now!" he yelled, turning back to Dan with a smile. Dan began some ludicrous-looking stretches and bounced on the spot like he was preparing for some Victorian bout. He killed maybe half a minute by doing this, hoping to get all the targets out into the killing ground. As more men began to emerge from the building, Bronson could wait no longer and advanced to get his breakfast.
"I warn you, I'm armed,"
Dan said suddenly, showing a demented smile, and then pointed his finger at the beast like he held an imaginary gun. Bronson stared at his finger for a second, looked at him directly, and roared with laughter. Steve lay prone, the crosshairs of his rifle sight resting dead center on the huge man standing in front of his friend. Dan wasn't a big man, but he certainly wasn't small, and he had a presence which couldn't be ignored. In current company, however, Dan was dwarfed. Steve watched intently, keeping his breathing slow and regulated as the monster suddenly laughed at Dan, pointing his imaginary gun.
The corner of Steve's mouth curled slightly and smiled before he let out his breath, held it again, and squeezed the trigger with the crosshairs still on Bronson's chest. The impact rocked him, but miraculously he stayed on his feet. His mouth opened and closed twice before he slowly turned and fell, exposing the gaping hole in his back. Bronson was dead. Now for the rest of the snake. Dan dived behind the defender, going low for the opposite door to retrieve his equipment. Simultaneously, he heard the crack of Steve's first round, followed quickly by the zipping sounds of more bullets homing in on their targets. All he heard was zip, crack, until a roar of challenge erupted from the back of his vehicle. Neil heard the exchange. He heard the zip, followed by the sickening impact, and then the report of the rifle reached his ears. He unclipped the last rubber straps holding the back down, then heaved the pole up and over to reveal his weapon. He roared as he did so, flung the heavy metal lid away, and racked the long bolt of the gun with his left hand. "I am the cavalry, bitches!" he yelled, then fired his first burst into 3 watery-eyed enforcers running from the building. Dan forced himself to be calm, methodical. Without his kit, he was a hindrance. He pulled on his vest, tightened it, and then picked up his carbine. His mags were fully loaded, and he had a lucky bullet in the pipe ready. He flicked the catch to automatic and ran away from the vehicle as he used it for cover. He climbed aboard the large crane sitting a few meters away, then ran up the extended arm to get on top of the containers. He dropped to one knee and fired a series of short bursts at the confused guards who were standing exposed. One of these was winged, clipped in the upper arm. He spun almost gracefully and fell the 15 feet into the prison pen, where he landed on his back with a thud. Dan fired 3 more bursts, once seeing his target snatched out of his scope as Lexi's, he assumed hers from the angle of the shot, bullet took the intended victim straight through the lower back and felled him instantly. Dan could hear the steady rhythm of carefully aimed shots coming from the snipers, interspersed with Neil's short bursts so as not to overheat the gun and risk a jam. He swore he could hear laughing from somewhere. He moved along, taking advantage of the top cover before the shooting stopped. Dan had to clear the building fast before any slackers had the chance to organize themselves. He seated a fresh magazine and racked the gun, then turned the torch on to full, which was blinding in close quarters, even in full daylight. He quickly went room to room, finding nothing until he reached the back of the building. He kicked open a door and advanced, seeing a man pull a girl to her feet by her hair. She couldn't have been much older than Leah. The ragged man started to issue a poorly planned threat to make this murderous intruder leave him alone, and died with 3 bullets in his head and 1 in his neck. Dan moved on, slinging the M4 on his back and drawing the stubby shotgun over his right shoulder as the stairwell was too tight for the carbine. He took the stairs quickly, bizarrely thinking how many times he would have heard bang clearing a house this fast before. Fuck the lot of them. New manual. Speed was the key here. The top of the stairs was suddenly filled with a man throwing a bomber jacket on before he froze, seeing Dan. The man's blood sprayed on Dan's face as his chest exploded from the heavy shot, which sent his body flying backwards to tangle the legs of another running along the corridor. Dan almost fired again, but recognized the body shape of a young woman just in time. He switched back to the M4 and cleared 5 other rooms, and the last being faced with what should be a difficult situation of a surrendering man. 1 in the chest, 1 in the head. He checked each room again and found 3 women coming out from their hiding places. He went back to the front door and tied a red strip of cloth from his pocket onto the end of his hot carbine, the agreed signal for "It's me, please don't shoot me in the bloody head." Neil called out to him saying it was safe. He came out slowly, holding the rag high as he stepped through a pile of broken bodies in front of Neil's smoking barrel. He turned to where the snipers would be and gave a thumbs up, the agreed signal for clear, stay on post, and shoot anything unfriendly. He safetied his weapon and went to Neil. 12, Neil said, slapping the big gun and instantly regretting it for the mild burn. 3 up there, Dan replied, pointing to the containers and trying not to think that they were bragging about ending human lives. He considered this for a second and imagined that the girls inside probably weren't there by choice. 4 inside, 1 point blank with the shotgun, he finished.
Neil made a pained sucking sound before delivering an extremely camp, nasty pasty. Dan climbed into the bullet-hole driver's door and found that of the few shots returned at them, only one had done serious damage. The radio was destroyed.
What were you expecting? Gratitude?
Neil offered to walk back to get the coach, but Dan told him to drive the Land Rover.
Go steady, Dan warned, knowing that Neil would be full of adrenaline still.
Dan walked amongst the piled bodies, thrown down in grotesque poses by the heavy bullets. Now he had seen for himself what they had been doing. He felt no remorse for attacking them, nor even for ambushing them as they had. He saw that some carried weapons, bats and knives, a pickaxe handle, even a whip. These were slavers, not survivors. They were dressed and equipped more for taking on a zombie horde than anything else. They weren't survivors, they were tyrants. He stalked above Bronson's shattered body and marveled again at the size of the man.
Bronson probably would have been capable of ripping him to pieces.
He collected a few shotguns from the scattered bodies and 3 handguns from Bronson and another now unrecognizable man, thanks to the bullet in his face, checking their pockets for spare ammo. None of the other weapons were much good, and those he had were filthy and pitted through a lack of proper maintenance. Movement in the doorway made him raise the carbine, and he saw 2 girls in their teens huddled together.
They stared at him with red eyes, waiting to see if he were to be their next master.
As if to indicate that they would not resist him, one of them slipped the shoulder of her dirty top down to show the skin. Dan nearly flipped, striding over to them with his weapons out of his hands.
You don't need to do that. Ever again. Not unless you choose to.
The girls looked blankly at him. He gave up. He stowed the revolvers he had recovered in his pockets and looked at the semi-automatic, as it didn't feel right. He ejected the magazine to find it filled with little yellow plastic balls. The bastard had been terrorizing these people using a BB gun, a child's toy. A low groan came from a body to his right. Conscious that he was being watched, he put his back to the building and drew his knife without making a show of it. He found the man, a boy really, with 2 bullet wounds in his abdomen. Neither had hit anything vital, but he was assured of a long death as he bled out in agony. Dan pushed the knife into the side of his neck, twisted it a quarter turn to allow the blood to gush out to the ground, then removed the blade and cleaned it on his clothes. As subtle as he had been about it, the 2 girls in the doorway had seen what he did. Neither showed any reaction as they were joined by another woman. Based on her lack of clothing, Dan guessed that she was the one he nearly cut in 2 at the top of the stairs. He decided he should address the sounds of excited talking from inside the pen of containers. He climbed the crane again, standing on top of the containers. The sun was higher now, and the murmuring sound swelled as he stood inside of them. He waited for a question to be asked of him, then remembered that these people had been punished for speaking up before. He would have to say something.
I come from a group of survivors. We do not keep prisoners. Everyone has a say. Everyone is protected. Everyone is fed properly. We rescued 2 people and learned of this place, so we came to set you free.
Over 60 eyes were glued to him, but nobody said a word. He could hear engines coming and glanced behind to double-check it was Neil and Ian. He saw the coach first, then the Land Rover in front as they crested the rise to approach him downhill. He turned back to the disheveled people in their pen.
We have medical care waiting at home, and everyone is invited to join us. You would not be a prisoner there. We offer our help.
He was growing concerned that they all just stared at him, and he turned to jump down before a small voice reached him.
Did you kill them?
The woman asked. Yes, Dan said after a brief pause. The woman's face dropped and her head and shoulders followed.
Others seemed to take this news badly too, but the majority rejoiced. He dropped down to see Neil coming forward ahead of the coach. Dan approached him as he stopped.
Think you can work that?
Dan asked, pointing at the crane. No, but I can probably drag one of these back instead, Neil answered as he indicated the shipping containers in front of him. He went to find a chain. Ian pulled up and maneuvered the coach into position like it was some aid mission to refugees. He supposed it was in a way. He poked his head into the coach, climbing the first few stairs. Both James and Ed looked sick. Whether that was from the bodies they stared at or being back in this place, he couldn't say. They hadn't wasted their time. Each seat of the coach had a blanket, bottle of water, an energy bar, and other snacks. Neil was rigging the chain he found at the crane to the towing hitch of his vehicle, having secured it to the corner of a container. He planned to drag it back at an angle, which would put it flush against the one next to it and leave a gap where they could file out towards the coach. Dan gave him the nod, and the tires bit into the rough concrete, hunkering the truck down on its springs. The container inched along, making a painful noise as it ground backwards, leaving deep scores. The gap opened enough for a person to get out, but nobody came. Wider still, enough for two, and still nobody ran from their prison. Dan waved Neil to stop, and then walked into the circular compound. Everywhere people hid, as others stood still in the open. He realized these people were more damaged than he expected.
It's not a trick, he yelled at them. You are free, and we are offering you shelter, food, medicine, and protection.
A few nervous people shuffled on their feet before James and Ed came into view. People recognized them, and another ripple of low talk went around. James ran in, heading straight for a container and shouting a girl's name as he went. He came back out into the growing light, leading a young woman. The migration started slowly as people followed those led by James and Ed. Then people jostled for position at the gap. He saw 3 people run as soon as they were out in the open. He knew they didn't trust him, so he did not try to stop them. Good luck to them, he thought. He watched the girl James was leading as she stood over the broken body of Bronson, pure hatred in her eyes. She spat in his lifeless face. People brought what meager possessions they had and filed onto the coach one by one. Some talked, but most were silent. Dan walked around their prison, seeing the way they had been forced to live. He eventually set his eyes on the guard he had wounded and knocked into the pen. His head had been bashed in and was almost completely flat. What was most worrying, though, was the empty holster at his waist. Humanitarian aid. Dan told the others about the missing gun. It concerned him deeply. He remembered training for hostage scenarios, where the hostage takers would hide themselves as victims. He had a terrible feeling that there was a wasp amongst the flies. He walked along the coach, wanting to draw the sig and search every person. They tore hungrily into the water and snacks, barely giving him a glance. Those who did look at him had eyes full of suspicion. He didn't have time for this. Their one-sided gun battle would have been audible for miles around.
We've got to get moving,
he said as he strode to the front. He had to trust that everyone knew what to do and led the coach back up the road past where they had waited. Joe had set up at the rendezvous point already. He watched the road ahead as Neil got back on the big gun, watching behind. Dan walked along the aisle of the coach again, looking for any subtle hint that any of the passengers were hiding something, like a gun. It was useless. They all looked edgy, and all but a few gave him looks that made him feel sick. They were waiting to see what tortures lay in wait from their new captors. One man had the courage to speak up.
Where are you taking us?
He asked. Dan spoke loudly for the benefit of the others.
We're taking you to our home. You can have a hot shower, clean clothes, and a warm bed. You'll have medical care and a proper meal.
Some regarded this news as too good to be true, and the mistrust was plain on their faces.
"What do we have to do?"
asked a woman. "Nothing," said Dan. "I hope you will want to stay and be a part of the group, but I promise you that you will not be captives. If you want to stay, you can find work to do, but you should all gather your strength and get better first." He hoped that they would trust him. Any show of strength on his part would put him in the category of those who had imprisoned them. Lexi arrived next, holding up 4 fingers to Neil in answer to a question Dan hadn't heard but easily guessed what they were talking about. That made 23. Steve drove up a short time after, and Dan saw his lips mouth 5 as he pulled up by Neil. 27, and only 25 bodies. Dan told himself the miscount was due to multiple people aiming at different targets. He was sure none survived, but without Ash or a team of forensic experts, he would never know. They formed up again, and this time Dan took Lexi's Land Rover and went up front with Steve. The coach rode in the middle, then Joe, and finally Lexi driving with Neil still manning the big gun. Twice the rear guard stopped and planned an ambush as the coach and lead vehicles went ahead slowly. Dan tried the CB and Lexi's Defender as they neared their home turf, finally getting through nearly 20 miles out. They made it home in 3 hours, where the welcoming committee was ready. Dan's High Commission for Refugees. The coach pulled up and the doors opened. Nobody came out. Dan jogged to the front door of the house as people were coming out, and he stopped in front of them. "They aren't the trusting type," he said, "and I think one of them may have taken a gun from a guard. Everyone be careful and send for me if there is any trouble." Kate went into the coach, wearing her old paramedic uniform for added reassurance.
"My name is Kate, and I am in charge of medical services. My team will see everyone to take care of you. There will be hot showers, clean clothes, and food. Please follow me," she said, and then turned away. Slowly, people started to emerge cautiously after James led the girl and encouraged the others to follow them. One by one, the scared, ragged survivors filed towards the house. A conveyor belt system had been organized where survivors gave their name to Karen, who was established on a desk in the reception area. Others were standing by to issue clean underwear, trousers, and tops, as well as a plastic bag containing basic toiletries and a towel. James led the girl to Karen, still holding her hand. She was thin, dirty, and had dark rings around her sunken eyes. "What's your name, sweet?"
asked Karen kindly.
"Pip,"
she said in a small voice, wild eyes scanning desperately. She gave her age and her former occupation, then shook her head when asked if she had any other skills. Kate led her straight into medical as soon as she was given some clean clothing. As the pattern was established, so too the pace picked up. Their suspicions were slowly being eroded as the promises were made good. Dan left Penny and the others hard at work sorting the new people into small groups where they were led to the bathrooms.
"Please keep the showers short for now. We don't want to run out of hot water,"
Carl said as he took a group of 3 men upstairs. Dan saw his rangers loitering around their gunship with Neil. He walked to them, as he didn't want a string of heavily armed troops walking past the traumatized intake. He had let Ash out, keeping him very close, despite his interest in all the new people who may feed him. He recognized Neil and bounded over, receiving some treats hidden in his leg pocket. Dan lit a smoke and offered one to Lexi. He inhaled deeply, eyes closed and head upturned, before letting it out slowly and blowing a plume of smoke over their heads. "Fucking nice work, people," he said at last. He looked at Steve and asked him how his perspective went.
"Took some trouble getting in place to start with, and had to move to a closer building and climb the stairs to the roof," he said. "Perfect line of sight, and I had that big bastard in my scope with you ready for the signal. When it went loud, I dropped 3 on the containers where they sat, then covered the windows as you went inside, taking a runner from the building after you went in."
Dan nodded approval.
worrying that he had missed one when he went inside. 5 for 5, 100%. He turned to Lexi. I got on target easy enough, but the height advantage wasn't enough to get an angle on you and Neil. I took 4 out as they came into view on the containers. 1 miss, she said. Dan guessed that she had been the one to snatch his target from his scope, but figured this wasn't the time to argue over the hunting etiquette of whose bird it should have been. Neil chimed in after. I heard Dozy Bollocks here challenging the Sasquatch to a boxing match and unclipped the back as quietly as I could. I saw the guy go down through a slot in the side, then jumped out of the cake like a stripper. He feigned taking offense at the intentionally invited giggles. There were half a dozen standing around the big guy waiting to see him kill someone. It was sick, like a playground bully with no teachers to run to. Neil got serious then. They went down before they had a chance to figure out what was happening. I took 7 down in the first 2 bursts, then another 5 as they ran out. I didn't hear it, but one bastard emptied a revolver at me. I saw him aiming as I was taking down a runner and saw the muzzle flashes. Look, he said theatrically and held his shirt out to the side. What? Said Dan, looking for the point of his show. Neil poked a finger through a small hole running through his top twice. It's a good job I'm thin, he said, joking. With anyone else, Dan would worry that he was in shock and that the panic of nearly catching a bullet in the stomach would affect him. Not Neil. He genuinely found it funny. Good news is, Neil went on, Thunderbird 2 here worked perfectly. Mike's rubber mounts were the key, I reckon. Dan agreed. Without the big machine gun, there would undoubtedly have been losses, probably himself. Good job, you lot, he said. Before he could continue, Steve asked, What about you? He paused, then said, You saw it. I pulled up and that Bronson was the one to greet me. I played dumb and offered to fight him for the survivors. I knew he wouldn't be able to resist the chance to show off, and he sent someone to fetch his audience. Then Steve ended his reign, and I grabbed my kit, taking 3 on top of the containers. What about inside? Steve inquired gently. 4 more. Stairs were very straight, so I had to use the shotgun. One came at me on the top of the stairs, and I hit him in the chest at close range. Damn near cut him in half. The gruesomeness of this revelation hung heavy for a few seconds before Dan snapped himself out of it. Quiet as you can. Guns into ops and clean them. Neil, just stow the belts for the GPMG for now. And everyone, keep sidearms on you until we're sure we haven't brought back anyone dangerous. I want to be sure no foxes ran home with the hounds, if you get my meaning. They took their leave, and Dan brought his own guns to his room where he cleaned them and locked them away, keeping the SIG. He left Ash in his room, now more of an ammo store than his quarters, and went to see how the High Commission for Refugees was faring. He opened his door to the sight of Leah holding a cup of coffee to him, smiling. He accepted it, thanked her, and said she could put her guns away now. She seemed a little put out, so Dan explained that these people had been kept prisoner by armed guards, and he didn't want to look like that was the case here. She understood. He took his coffee to the dining hall, flanked by his eager apprentice, and saw lines of freshly washed people wearing a collection of new clothes, mostly prison tracksuits. In hindsight, maybe not the best things to put them in, but it would have to do for tonight. Kara was greeting the new arrivals, explaining which way the impressive buffet went, and inviting them to get a plate and join the queue, which led to Nina dishing up large helpings of pasta bake. Kara and her team had outdone themselves with the spread, which included a long table full of pastries and cakes. Andrew was probably having kittens somewhere over the amount of extra supplies they had used. There were cans and bottles of sweet drinks, even cartons of cigarettes and lighters left out. The people seemed more relaxed, and had even started to talk amongst themselves quietly. He felt a few cold looks from some, but he joined the line for lunch. 3 times he had to refuse being offered to jump ahead of those who clearly needed it more than him. He sat with Leah, aside from the others. None of them joined him until a freshly showered Pip sat down a few seats away.
She hesitated before summoning up the courage to turn to Dan and offer their thanks. She seemed like she wanted to say more, but didn't.
You're welcome, Pip. It's good to have you here safely,
he said quite loudly, eager to show the others that he wasn't guarding them. He could guess from her interaction with the former Bronson how she had earned her food previously. That was what offended him the most about the way life had become after it happened, like the Mad Max twins and the Country Boys. Some people were just waiting for the bigger players to leave before they threw their weight around and took advantage of others. Sure, they were surviving in their own way, but what good was the human race without humanity?
Reversing the Pavlovian effect. It took days for most of the 31 survivors to adapt to freedom. Some of them had been captives for months, others only a week or two. The brutality they had lived under was terrible, and Dan could only guess at the damage done. The downside of this was that they had effectively taken in 31 mouths to feed who were all weak, malnourished, injured, and scared. He knew he wouldn't be lucky enough to have found a couple of Special Forces reconnaissance soldiers, and the thought lingered on how many of those they had killed would have been offered positions as rangers if they had been found here instead. That led to the thought of how many of his own would have become enforcers if the scenario were different. He pushed that thought from his head. The answer was simple. None. None of his would act like that, not even to save their own. It wasn't right. And using violence was not the same as what had been done to these people. At least, that was the theory he swore by. Slowly they began to integrate. After a week, Maggie took 10 of the new arrivals and taught them the basics of the gardening side. Another 5 accepted work on the farm for Chris. One group of 8 kept very much to themselves, almost a split faction. Dan kept a close eye on those. Pip insisted she earn her keep, but was outright refused by Kate as she found her in very poor health. She told them that she had been pregnant when it happened and gave birth to a stillborn baby in their makeshift prison. James hung around her like a moth, but Dan saw he was annoying her and sent him back to work with Pete. He slipped the old gamekeeper a half bottle of Johnny Walker Red Label and asked him to keep the man very busy and tired. Pete gave a conspiratorial wink, and true to his word had James out until very late netting rabbits, then up before dawn to deal with them. He kept him out hunting overnight at least once a week. The ringleader of the separatist front approached Dan one day as he smoked. Ash didn't like the look of him and made that clear with a low growl. Dan told him to stay, and he lay on the ground, never taking his eyes off his master as he walked away with the stranger. His name was Martin. He was a thin, pinched-looking man with a permanent scowl. He started with some insincere thanks for the hospitality, but he struck Dan as a man who hadn't unpacked his suitcase. Dan listened in silence. His dad had always said to let the other person fill the silence and only speak when you had something important to say. Dan stopped and turned to him. I'm not a man to piss about, as you have probably guessed. Make your point, please. Martin straightened himself and asked permission for him and the other 7 to leave. You don't need my permission, but you will need my help, Dan said. Where do you plan to go? He asked. Martin was clearly annoyed that he was being asked to tell this man his secrets and said nothing. Let me guess, Dan said. You're either planning to hit the coast and take a boat, probably south for the continent, or you know of a place where you can set up by yourselves. Martin looked uncomfortable and a little embarrassed. South of France, he said finally. Dan took his time finishing his cigarette, then looked at him directly. I told you all that we were getting you out of there. We fed you, we fixed you, we clothed you, he explained. At no point did I say that any of you had to repay that, even though we risked the lives of everyone here to do so. I'm not rubbing it in, I'm stating facts, he finished. Martin said nothing. Speak to your friends tonight. Then find me after breakfast tomorrow. We'll help you plan your routes, your equipment, teach you some things you may not have learned, and find you a vehicle." He turned away, leaving a shocked Martin nervously clutching the stolen gun in his coat pocket. Martin let it go and wiped his sweaty palm on his leg, worried that it was too easy. The following morning, Dan emerged to take Ash outside. He hadn't even had a coffee before he went back inside to find Martin waiting for him. Dan held up a hand and asked for 5 minutes, visiting the toilets and the kitchen for a pot of coffee before he returned. He poured a cup for Martin, not bothering to ask if he took milk or sugar. All of his team drank black coffee, probably because he did, although he was sure Leah probably had a stash of sugar somewhere. Martin was invited to explain their plan. They wanted to head for the southwest coast, where one of the group had a sailing boat. They planned to get there, stock up, and sail for France, where another of them had a gîte near the coast. Dan asked what supplies he needed. "A few days' food and water. Nothing else," Martin replied. "Maps?" Dan inquired. "A road map would be helpful," Martin answered. Dan stood and took a gulp of coffee before selecting an unused A3-size road atlas book of the United Kingdom. He dropped it on the table in front of Martin and offered rucksacks and sleeping bags, as well as some other basic equipment to see them to the coast. They should do that in 3 days easily, even given the degraded state of the roads and the risk of banditry. Martin still looked at him suspiciously before blurting out, "What's the catch?" "No catch. None at all. If you want to go, then good luck. I'll find a minibus or a pair of vehicles for you today to leave in the morning," Dan said. "Honestly," Martin said, his face bleeding. "Yes. While we're on the subject of honesty," Dan said, backing a hunch, "don't you think you'll need something better than the little handgun you've got?" Martin's face told him he was right. "Show it to me," Dan instructed him. Martin reached into a pocket and carefully produced an ancient small-caliber revolver. The thing would most likely fire, but you'd have to be holding it to someone's head to kill them. He checked the cylinder. 4 rounds, practically useless. Dan made a judgment call. "We have a rule here. Nobody carries a gun unless trained and authorized. By me." He spun the gun gently around on the table. "You'll get this back in the morning, along with a good pump-action shotgun and spare ammunition. It's easy to use and maintain. You'll have a vehicle by then. You have my word." Martin had been played into a corner, and he had little choice but to trust the man. Leah wandered in shortly after to find Dan sat at the table with a pathetically small gun. She gave him a puzzled look and a greeting. "Morning, kid. Get up. We're going to buy a car." You break it, you buy it. Dan took his discovery, the now familiar 3 heads riding along looking out at the world. They took spare fuel and a starter pack as they headed to the coach company where they found the rescue vehicle. Inside, they practiced the building clearance in a real situation. Dan was very happy with Leah's technique, but unsure if she had the maturity to make a challenge and maybe shoot someone if she had to. They selected a 16-seat minibus and set about getting it started and fueled. They used a cigarette lighter pump to inflate the tires and left it running to settle the disused engine. Dan asked Leah if she had a D1 category on her license. She was confused and unhelpfully pointed out that she didn't have a driving license. "Well, you're going to have to drive mine then," he nonchalantly declared. Her face slowly broke into a characteristic grin when she tried to hide how excited she was. "You're okay with the automatic gearbox now?" She was. She had been watching his movements as he drove for months. "Yeah," she tried as coolly as possible. "You sure? Because the last time you tried, you crashed into a 40-grand convertible, if you remember," he said, enjoying goading her. She smiled sweetly. "True, but now I know how to strip that weapon you're holding in the dark. People change." Once again, he couldn't argue with her logic.
He held the keys out to her, but held tight to them as she tried to pull them away. "Don't crash it," he said firmly.
"If I do, I'll get you a new one for your birthday. When is it, by the way?" she asked innocently.
"Bugger off." They set off back home, Dan driving the minibus up front with Ash riding in the passenger seat. He looked in the rearview mirror. There was a 13-year-old driving a nearly 60,000-pound 3-liter diesel off-road car. If that wasn't bizarre enough, she was driving it well and carried 2 guns, which she knew how to use. The following morning came and went. The council had wholly agreed to allow the group to leave. The unanimous decision was that to prevent them would be to imprison them. They supported the minibus idea, and they were given extra clothing as well as basic camping supplies. Dan had kept his word and returned the tiny revolver to Martin. He had also included a stock Remington with no attachments and showed the group the basics of operating and cleaning it. He added a box of ammo, hunting cartridges, but still quite a heavy load. They left, and life moved on easily enough. Dead weight. Penny called a council meeting that evening. She had been a rare sight amongst the occupants of the house in the last few days. For that matter, she had spent a lot of time in bed recently. She passed it off as just being a little under the weather, but refused all offers of help from Kate. She saw her personal matters as exactly that, personal. She was in a bad enough mood as it was, and the pains in her belly were crippling some days. She knew it was something serious, something that needed doctors and hospitals and expensive machinery to take scans that consultants would meet and discuss. She walked into the meeting with her own dark cloud hanging over her, and her feelings made themselves known a little too strongly.
"We have 8 people here who are not contributing," she started, holding up a hand to stop the few protests she saw forming. "I know one of them is unwell after being pregnant, which is a passable excuse for part-time employment, but that still leaves 7 who are a drain."
She went to continue, but was hit with a wave of pain from her stomach. Kate took the opportunity to jump in before the rant started again.
"I'll stop you right there, Penny," she said acidly. "The girl is malnourished and has been badly mistreated. It's a miracle she didn't die in labor, and that's taken a toll on her body. She stays close to me and my team at all times, not negotiable. And as for the others, they are also physically very weak. I've got 2 in medical right now if you care to check."
Penny winced, fought back a cry of pain, and sat down. Kate stood and continued.
"That leaves 5 frightened, damaged, and abused people who aren't ready to work a chain gang for you, so you can—"
"Kate, enough," snapped Dan. Not because he disagreed, but because he saw the pain hidden in Penny's eyes.
"What? You're on her side?"
Kate asked angrily. "No. Look at her," he said as Penny stood with some difficulty and turned to leave the room. Dan stood too, and only just made it in time to stop her from cracking her skull on the steps to the door. Kate barged him aside to check her. Typical paramedic. She did everything she could to save a life, regardless of what she thought of the person. Kate called Penny's name and was rewarded with a faint squeak through shallow breathing. Penny's eyes screwed shut, and her body went into spasm as the pain overtook her again. Kate looked at Dan with wide eyes and said, "Trolley." He ran to medical, ignoring the worried looks from those he thundered past, returning with the ambulance stretcher and raising the panic levels further. Penny was wheeled through, and the shouted names from Kate ended the free time of her team. Dan followed and had the door shut in his face. He turned to the assembled crowd and tried to act blithe. "It's okay, everyone. Just let them do their jobs," he said with a smile he was sure was as fake as a gold Rolex from a market stall. He maintained the TV presenter face as he strode into the dining room to find the council still seated, bar 2 members. "Meeting adjourned, I think. Unless anyone has anything else," he said. If they did, they had probably forgotten it now. Field promotion.